Get ready for a chilling night. Immerse yourself in horror stories that will accompany you until you sleep. If these dark narratives help you delve into the world of dreams, don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel for more eerily peaceful nights. It was a chilly winter night in Boston, and I, Parker, was content in my new home in the North End neighborhood. My apartment, though old, exuded a cozy charm with its creaking floors under my feet, and walls that seemed to hold stories of past eras. My neighbors were discreet, contributing to the peaceful atmosphere of the place. However, on that particular night, an unusual event broke the serenity of my refuge. I was absorbed in a book in the tranquility of my room, when an uncommon sound coming from the living room caught my attention. Pausing my reading, I fell silent. Soon, I heard the sound again. Something had been knocked over. My heart raced, and an icy apprehension enveloped me. Instinctively, I grabbed the flashlight within reach and cautiously stepped out of the room. The light from the flashlight cast eerie shadows on the walls as I advanced. Step by step, the smell of old wood and dust filled the air. As I turned the corner towards the living room, I came across a disturbing scene. One of my chairs lay on the floor, and scratch marks adorned the wooden floor. There were no signs of forced entry, and the windows were tightly closed. A chill ran down my spine. How could someone have entered without leaving a trace, and why? My thoughts wandered to the possibility of it being just the wind or the quirks of an old building, but even so, an inner voice insisted that there was something more sinister afoot. The idea of being watched sent shivers down my spine. Although I had no concrete proof, I stood paralyzed, the flashlight trembling in my hand. The idea that someone or something had broken into my apartment undetected was terrifying. My heart pounded, and I felt vulnerable in my own home. I tried to rationalize the incident. Maybe it was a rat that had sneaked in and caused the ruckus. Or it could be a structural issue in the old building. But the scratch marks on the floor seemed to indicate something more deliberate. I decided to examine the apartment more carefully, starting with the kitchen. I opened the cabinets and looked under the sink, but found nothing out of the ordinary. The silence was heavy, and I could feel invisible eyes watching me. A sense of paranoia grew within me. Just as I was about to give up, I heard a sound coming from the bedroom. I ran back, my heart in my throat. The closet door was open, and my clothes seemed disturbed, as if someone had gone through them. A chill ran down my spine. I wasn't imagining things. There was something, or someone, in the apartment with me. I stood there, paralyzed, unsure of what to do. Part of me wanted to run away, but another part wanted to stay and face the unseen intruder. I decided I wouldn't give in to fear. I grabbed a baseball bat I kept by the bed and positioned myself at the bedroom door, ready to face whatever was in there. I stood at the entrance of the room, the baseball bat firmly held in my sweaty hands. My heart was hammering in my chest, and I could feel the sweat trickling down my temple. The darkness seemed to pulse around me, and I wondered if something was hiding in the shadows, watching me, waiting for the right moment to strike. I tried to calm my breathing and pushed aside the fears, preparing to face the unknown. With a quick move, I turned on the light and advanced into the room. The light revealed an empty space, the curtains gently swaying with the night breeze, but I knew I wasn't alone. "Who's there? Show yourself!" I shouted, my voice sounding challenging in the silence. My eyes scanned every corner of the room, but there was no one in sight. Just as I was about to turn and leave, I heard a whisper behind me. I spun around quickly. The bat raised, but there was nothing there. A chill ran down my spine, and I felt a malevolent presence in the room. It was as if something invisible was crawling towards me, exuding an aura of pure malevolence. My entire body was on high alert, and I knew I had to get out of there. I ran out of the room, the bat still in my hand, and slammed the door shut. My heart was racing, and I felt confused and scared. What the hell was going on? I stood in the living room, my gaze nervously wandering around the apartment. My brain tried to rationalize what had happened. Maybe it was some sort of illusion, a trick of my mind, but the scratch marks on the floor and the persistent feeling of being watched told me otherwise. I decided to investigate the building, talk to the neighbors to see if anyone else had experienced something similar. I walked down the corridors knocking on doors, but no one seemed to be home. The building seemed strangely deserted, which only added to the sense of isolation and mystery. Just as I was about to give up, I saw an older woman exiting an apartment at the end of the hallway. She looked at me with caution, and I could see fear in her eyes. I introduced myself and told her about the strange happenings in my apartment. To my surprise, she seemed relieved that I had spoken to her. "You're not the first to report such events," she whispered, casting nervous glances to the sides. "This building has a dark history. There are rumors that a previous tenant experienced something similar and eventually disappeared without a trace. They say he was haunted by something invisible, a malevolent presence that took him away in the darkness of night. I personally think it's psychological, but who knows?" Her words hit me like a punch in the gut. Was my apartment haunted? Or was I becoming paranoid? And what happened to the previous tenant? The woman didn't know, but she advised me to leave while I could. Chilled to the bone, I went back to my apartment, packing my things in a hurry. I wouldn't stay to find out if the rumors were true. As I left, I looked back, feeling the invisible eyes of the building watching me. I had escaped something sinister, and this would be a bedtime story I'd tell for many years to come. My name is Amy, and I'm a psychology student at Thornwood University. I've never been much into supernatural things, but after that fateful night, my worldview changed completely. It was the second day of the Hungry Ghost Festival, a Chinese tradition I barely knew, when everything started to unravel. My roommate, Nina, entered our dorm with an expression that mixed fear and confusion. She pulled me to sit on her bed, her hands trembling slightly. "Amy, you won't believe what just happened," she began, her voice barely a whisper. The air conditioning knob in my car, it turned to 0 by itself, twice. I laughed, thinking she was exaggerating. "Oh, come on, Nina. It was probably just a mechanical issue," I replied, trying to calm her down. But before I could continue, our curtains flew open violently. The sound made us jump. The windows were closed. There was no wind. I felt a chill run down my spine. Nina let out a muffled scream, her eyes wide with terror. "See? I told you something strange was happening," she exclaimed, her voice trembling. I tried to keep calm, but I felt my heart racing. "Let's get out of here," I suggested, grabbing my bag. "We can go out for dinner and clear our heads." We headed down to the parking lot, chatting nervously about what had happened. When we reached Nina's car, I opened the driver's door. But as I tried to close it, I felt an inexplicable resistance. It was as if something invisible was blocking the door. I tried once, twice, 3 times. On the 4th attempt, I managed to close it with a dull thud. But the relief was short-lived. As soon as the door closed, I felt a pressure against my body, as if something was pushing me against the seat. I looked at Nina, who was pale as a ghost. "Did you feel that?" I asked, my voice failing. She could only nod, unable to speak. With trembling hands, I drove to the campus dining hall, trying to maintain my composure. Nina remained silent, her eyes scanning the shadows dancing on the trees along the way. The campus felt different that night, as if a sinister fog had settled over it. We entered the almost empty dining hall, the sound of our footsteps echoing through the hall. "It must be because of the Hungry Ghost Festival," Nina murmured. "They say the spirits roam freely during this time." I tried to ignore her comment, focusing on choosing my meal. We sat at a table in the corner, the heavy silence between us. Suddenly, a loud crash made us jump. A tray had fallen to the floor, its contents scattered. The strange thing was that there was no one nearby. "This is getting ridiculous," I said, trying to sound brave. "It's probably just the wind." But my words died in my throat when I noticed something disturbing. The shadows in the corner of the dining hall seemed to move, not in a natural way, as when the light changes, but with purpose, as if they had a life of their own. Nina followed my gaze and stifled a scream. "Amy," she whispered, her voice shaking, "I think we're not alone here." I wanted to tell her she was imagining things, that it was just the light playing tricks, but then I felt it. A cold, heavy presence, as if something was watching us from the shadows. The air around us turned icy, and I could see our breath forming small clouds. It was impossible, considering it was the middle of summer. My rational mind struggled to find an explanation, but every fiber of my body screamed that something supernatural was happening. "Let's get out of here," I said, standing up abruptly. Nina needed no second invitation. We ran out of the dining hall, our hearts pounding in our chests. The university horror stories I had always thought were just urban legends suddenly seemed terrifyingly real. As we ran through the dark campus, I had the disturbing feeling that we were being followed, not by a person but by something that didn't belong in this world. The streetlights flickered as we passed, as if reacting to our presence, or to the presence of whatever was chasing us. "Where are we going?" Nina asked. Breathless, I had no answer. Our dorm seemed too far away, and the idea of returning to that room filled me with dread. Then I spotted the library building, its lights still on. "There," I pointed. "Let's go to the library." We ran to the library, our panting breaths echoing in the silent night. The heavy doors creaked open, and the smell of old books enveloped us. The place was almost empty, with only a few scattered students at the study tables. "Let's go to the third floor," I whispered to Nina. "It's quieter up there." We climbed the stairs quickly, the sound of our steps muffled by the worn carpet. Upon reaching the top, a chill ran down my spine. The air felt denser, charged with an odd energy. We chose a table in the corner, surrounded by tall shelves. Nina settled in, her eyes still wide with fear. "Amy," she murmured, "do you think we're safe here?" Before I could answer, a book fell from a nearby shelf, landing with a dull thud. My heart raced. Slowly, I stood up to pick up the book. It was an ancient tome on urban university legends. When I opened it, the pages turned by themselves, stopping at a chapter on haunted dorms. This can't be a coincidence, I thought, feeling the fear grow in my chest. Suddenly, the lights flickered, plunging us into darkness for a few seconds. When they came back on, I noticed a shadowy figure at the end of the corridor. It was tall and undefined, like a shadow gaining form. I blinked, and it disappeared. "Did you see that?" I asked Nina, my voice shaking. She nodded, unable to speak. The air around us turned icy, and I could see our breath forming in small clouds. The shelves started to tremble slightly, books swaying in their places. It was as if the entire library was alive, pulsing with supernatural energy. "We have to get out of here," Nina said, her voice barely above a whisper. I agreed, but as we stood up, I realized we were surrounded. Shadows moved between the shelves, indistinct forms that seemed to be approaching. I grabbed Nina's hand and we ran towards the stairs. Books started falling from the shelves, as if thrown by invisible hands. The sound of turning pages and thumping covers followed us, a terrible cacophony that grew louder with each step. We stumbled down the stairs, panic taking over. The few students on the ground floor looked at us confused, unaware of the terror we were experiencing. We burst through the library doors, the cool night air hitting us like a slap. "Where to now?" Nina asked, breathless. I had no answer. Our dorm seemed too far away, and the thought of returning to that room filled me with dread. Then I spotted the building of our faculty, its lights still on. "There," I pointed. "Let's go to the faculty building." We ran through the campus, the darkness of the night engulfing everything around us. Every shadow seemed to move, every noise made our hearts leap. "We have to go back to the dorm," I said, pulling Nina by the arm. It was our only option, as frightening as it seemed. As we approached the building, I noticed something strange. The windows of our room were illuminated, a flickering light dancing behind the curtains. "Impossible," I muttered. We were sure we had turned off all the lights before leaving. We climbed the stairs in silence, the fear growing with each step. When we reached our floor, the corridor was immersed in an unnatural darkness. The lights, normally on 24 hours a day, were all off. The only source of light came from under our door. With trembling hands, I turned the doorknob. The door opened with a creak, revealing a scene that froze my blood. Our furniture was floating a few inches off the ground, clothes and books swirling in the air as if caught in an invisible whirlwind. At the center of it all, hovering over our beds, was a shadowy figure. It wasn't solid, but neither was it completely ethereal. Its contours undulated like black smoke, and where a face should have been, I saw only a dark, terrifying void. Nina let out a muffled scream, clutching my arm so tightly her nails left marks. The entity turned towards us, and I felt a wave of cold and despair hit me. It was as if all happiness and hope had been sucked out of the world. At that moment, something inside me awoke. Maybe it was adrenaline. Maybe it was pure survival instinct. "Enough!" I shouted, my voice echoing through the room. "This is our space. You are not welcome here." To my surprise, the figure recoiled slightly. Encouraged, I continued, "Whatever you are, you have no power over us. Leave!" Nina, realizing what I was doing, joined in. "Get out of our room! Get out of our lives!" The entity emitted a sound like a distant, painful howl. The floating object started to fall, and the darkness that surrounded the figure began to dissipate with a final ear-piercing scream. The presence exploded into 1,000 fragments of shadow, vanishing into the air. The silence that followed was deafening. Nina and I sat on our beds, breathless, barely believing what had just happened. Slowly, the corridor lights came back on, and our room returned to normal. Exhausted and still in shock, we sat in our beds. What was that?" Nina asked, her voice trembling. I shook my head, unable to find an answer. That night changed everything I believed about the world. As the sun rose, bringing the promise of a new day, Nina and I made a pact to never tell anyone what happened, who would believe us. But we knew the truth, the university horror stories, the tales of haunted dorms, the urban legends circulating on campus. They might hold more truth than we ever imagined. The experience marked us deeply, reminding us that there are more mysteries in the world than our philosophy can explain. And as university life went on, Nina and I carried with us the knowledge that sometimes the veil between our world and the unknown is thinner than we'd like to believe. It was one of those nights when the cold wind whistled through the deserted streets, making the dry leaves dance in whirlwinds along the sidewalks. I'm Maggie, and I was curled up in my apartment, trying to study for my college finals. Solitude was my constant companion, and the dim light of the lamp created a peaceful yet somewhat intimidating atmosphere. I turned on the TV to take a break from my studying routine, looking for something that could distract my tired mind. That's when I stumbled upon a program about real-life horror stories. The introduction immediately caught my attention, presenting an intriguing narrative about a haunted house known as No End House. According to the legend, the house was a terror labyrinth, consisting of 9 rooms, each designed to challenge and terrify those who dared to enter. The stories surrounding that place were chilling, with accounts of people facing their worst phobias and experiencing paranormal phenomena. Some even suggested that the house was a portal to another dimension, where the laws of physics did not apply. I was instantly fascinated and, at the same time, a bit skeptical. I've always been drawn to scary stories, but I maintained a healthy sense of skepticism. However, there was something about No End House that intrigued me. Perhaps it was the conviction with which the interviewees spoke about their experiences or the eerie images that were displayed. That's when my boyfriend, David Parker, called. His voice sounded excited, which was unusual since he was usually calm and contained. "Maggie, you won't believe what just happened to me. I've just been challenged to enter the No End House," he said, full of enthusiasm. My heart seemed to stop for a moment upon hearing those words. I knew David well enough to know that when he decided to do something, nothing would change his mind. "David, wait," I pleaded. "I've heard stories about this place, and they're not good. People say that this house is cursed, that bad things happen in there." David laughed, trying to reassure me. "Don't worry, I can take care of myself. Plus, they're offering a $500 prize. Think of it as a paid adventure, and who knows, We might use that money for something special. I tried to argue further, but David had already hung up, eager to embark on his journey to No End House. I felt a knot in my stomach and a sense of foreboding. Scary stories and supernatural phenomena had always freaked me out. And now my boyfriend was getting involved in something that sounded like it was straight out of a horror movie. The following days were a mix of anxiety and curiosity as I awaited David to start his journey. He kept me updated on his preparations, revealing that the challenge was organized by an anonymous group that had created the house as a sort of extreme horror attraction. The rules were simple. He had to go through all 9 rooms, and if he succeeded, he would receive the cash prize. David sounded confident, but I couldn't ignore the voice in my head telling me that something would go wrong. On the day he left, I felt helpless, unable to stop him. "I'll be back before you know it," he said, smiling, trying to reassure me. The hours dragged on as I waited for news from David. My heart raced every time my phone rang, fearing the worst. On the 3rd night, I received a call. My heart stopped when I saw David's name on the screen. "Maggie." David's voice sounded weak and trembling. I made it." I went through all the rooms. It was the most terrifying thing I've ever experienced, but I survived. I felt a mix of relief and curiosity consuming me. "David, where are you?" "What happened? Tell me everything." David sighed, and I could hear the sound of his ragged breathing. "I'm somewhere outside the city. They brought me here by car, blindfolded. I don't exactly know where I am, but I'll find a way back." His words left me worried. "David, are you okay? What happened in there? Why does your voice sound like that?" David hesitated, and I could hear the conflict in his voice. I saw things, Maggie. Things I can't explain. Each room was scarier than the other. I faced my worst phobias, shadow creatures, and sounds that drove me crazy. My curiosity won, and I begged for more details. David then described each room, from the first, where he was attacked by invisible insects, to the last, where he found his doppelganger, begging not to be hurt. I was in a frenzy, Maggie. I couldn't think straight, so I stabbed him. I had to do it to get to the last room. That's where I found the letter declaring me the winner. I was shocked by David's account, imagining the terror he must have faced. "Oh my God, David, this is insane. You need to get out of there immediately. Come back home. We're right in the city center." David agreed, and his voice sounded a bit stronger. "You're right. I'll find a way back. I'm sorry if I scared you. It wasn't my intention." We said our goodbyes, and I sat there paralyzed, thinking about what David had gone through. Real scary stories had always fascinated me, but now I was living one, and the feeling was terrifying. The weeks went by, and David didn't return. I called countless times, sent messages, and even went to the police, but no one seemed to know of his whereabouts. My concern turned into despair, and I found myself immersed in a nightmare. The nights were the worst, and my mind wandered to the worst possible scenarios. I started investigating on my own, trying to find out something about No End House. I discovered that other people had also taken on the challenge, but none of them seemed to know what had happened to David. 3 weeks after his disappearance, I decided to take action. I got in my car and drove to the location where David had said the journey began. It was an old, isolated house in the woods, just like in horror stories. My heart hammered in my chest as I stepped out of the car and walked towards the door. The house seemed empty, but I could feel a sinister presence watching my movements. I entered, calling out for David, my voice echoing through the dark corridors. I heard a sound, like a distant whisper. I followed the sound, finding a partially open door. I stepped into the room and froze at what I saw. David was there, chained to a wall, his body thin and bruised. I rushed to him, my eyes filling with tears. "David, oh my God, what have they done to you?" He smiled weakly, his eyes shining with relief. "Maggie, you came to find me. I knew you would. What is going on here, David? Who did this to you?" My voice sounded furious as I searched for a way to free him. David sighed, his voice weak and trembling. "I don't know for sure. After you couldn't reach me anymore, I started investigating. I found out that this house is more than just a horror attraction. It's as if it has a life of its own, sucking people in. Horrified, I asked, "What do you mean? How can we get out of here?" David looked at me, his eyes full of despair. "I don't know if we can get out, Maggie. I think we're trapped, but you have to try. Go away. Leave while you can." My heart broke hearing his words. "I won't leave you here, David. We'll find a way out, together." The search for an exit turned into a nightmare, with each room presenting new terror. We encountered shadow creatures, sinister figures that watched us from the darkness, and deadly traps. It was as if the house were alive, testing us at every step. As we progressed through No End House, we felt that something was amiss. Who had created this house of horrors? What was the ultimate purpose behind all this psychological torture? The questions echoed in our minds, fueling our determination to find answers. "We can't stop now," I said, feeling a growing impulse within me. "We have to figure out who is behind this. There are more people involved, I know it." Maggie nodded, her eyes reflecting the same determination I felt. "We'll keep going. We need to expose whoever is responsible for all this terror. Other people might be in danger." Our journey through No End House had been transformative. We faced our fears, overcame obstacles that seemed insurmountable, and in the process developed an inner strength we didn't know we possessed. The house seemed to have a life of its own, presenting new challenges with each room we entered. But we pressed on, driven by curiosity and the desire to help other potential victims. We faced rooms that challenged our sanity, with illusions that confused our senses, and shadow creatures that seemed to emerge from our worst nightmares. With each room we overcame, we felt we were getting closer to unraveling the mystery. Finally, we caught sight of the exit. A bright light seemed to call us, promising answers and freedom. Running towards it, we felt a mix of relief and anticipation. We crossed the threshold, leaving No End House behind. The sun warmed our faces, providing a moment of peace. But we knew our journey wasn't over. There were more mysteries to unravel, more secrets hidden in the shadows. Together, Maggie and I vowed to continue seeking answers. Even if the path ahead was uncertain and dangerous, we were determined to expose the truth behind No End House and to protect other innocent people from going through what we had. Escaping No End House was just the beginning of our mission to uncover the true scary stories that were yet to come. Who was the brain behind it all? That was the question that drove us forward. My name is Zoe, and I will never forget that Sunday night in the apartment I shared with my friends, Alice and Jinghui. It was our traditional horror movie night, a tradition we started soon after moving close to campus. The air was heavy with anticipation as we settled in the living room, ready for another night of controlled scares. The movie had barely started when Alice's usually quiet Yorkshire Terrier began to growl ferociously at the bathroom ceiling. The dog's unusual behavior sent shivers down my spine. Alice, trying to calm the situation, went to check. Her trembling voice echoed through the apartment. "Girls, come see this." We rushed to the bathroom, our hearts racing. The ceiling panel was open, revealing a disturbing black void. We exchanged nervous glances, none of us wanting to admit the fear that was starting to settle in. "Let's call security," Jinghui suggested, her voice barely masking the tremor. The guard arrived minutes later, carrying a ladder. As he climbed up to close the panel, I noticed his hands shaking. Something in the air seemed wrong. The apartment, once cozy, now seemed to whisper dark secrets. We returned to the living room, but the movie no longer mattered. My mind was filled with unanswered questions. That night, lying in bed, I couldn't sleep. The apartment sounds seemed to amplify every creak of the floor, every gust of wind against the window. Something had changed, and I knew, deep down in my soul, that our university life would never be the same. The university horror stories that once entertained us now seemed like a sinister portent of what was to come. Chapter 2. The return of the unexplained. A week passed, and the incident with the open panel seemed to have dissolved into the university routine. However, when Sunday came around again, bringing with it our horror movie night, a sense of apprehension hung in the air. Alice's usually serene Yorkshire Terrier was restless, his black eyes fixed on the corridor leading to the bathroom. We had barely settled in when the little dog started growling, his tiny body trembling with fear. Alice and Jinghui exchanged concerned glances, but it was me who stood up. "I'll go check," I announced, trying to sound braver than I felt. I walked down the hallway, my steps echoing disturbingly in the sudden silence. Upon entering the bathroom, my heart stopped. The ceiling panel was open again, a black mouth mocking our sanity. We called security, a man named Rashid, for the second time. When he arrived, his eyes widened at the sight of the open panel. "This isn't normal," he muttered, climbing the ladder with visible hesitation. "What happened next will be forever etched in my memory." Rashid, upon looking into the hole in the ceiling, began to recite a prayer in Arabic, his voice shaking. Suddenly, he stopped. When he turned to climb down the ladder, his face was empty, his eyes as opaque as a doll's. Without a word, he left the apartment as if he were an automaton. We stood paralyzed, the real university horror we had always feared finally reaching us. "Alice, no!" I shouted, but it was too late. She was already climbing the ladder, her determination overcoming her fear. When she put her head into the ceiling hole, a deadly silence fell upon the apartment. The silence that followed Alice's action was deafening. Jinghui and I watched, frozen, as our friend descended the ladder with the same vacant look we had seen in Rashid. She walked past us without a word, her eyes fixed on a distant point that only she could see. In that moment, I felt like I was living one of those scary campus stories we used to share during our horror nights. We spent the night awake, too terrified to sleep. The apartment, once our refuge, now felt like a sinister prison. Every shadow hid a threat. Every noise made our hearts race. Alice's Yorkshire whimpered softly, curled up in a corner, as if sensing the oppressive presence that had taken over our home. When the sun finally rose, it brought momentary relief. Alice blinked several times, as if waking from a deep trance. Her voice, when she finally spoke, was a hoarse whisper. I felt something terrible. Jinghui and I drew closer, anxious and fearful of her words. Alice described a feeling of suffocation, as if an invisible rope was strangling her when she put her head into the ceiling hole. "There was something there," she murmured, her eyes still distant. "Something that descended with me on my shoulders. It was only when it went back up to the ceiling that I felt free again." Her words chilled us to the bone. This was no longer one of the university scary stories we used to share for fun. It was real, tangible, and it was happening to us. Without hesitation, we made the decision to move out immediately. As we hastily packed our things, we couldn't help but constantly look up at the ceiling, fearing that the malevolent presence might manifest itself again at any moment. In the days that followed our hasty escape from the apartment, we tried to resume our normal university lives, but the experience left deep marks on each of us. Alice, in particular, seemed to carry an invisible weight. Her eyes, once bright and full of life, now often appeared distant, as if a part of her was still trapped in that terrible moment in the bathroom. Jinghui threw herself into her studies with an almost frenzied intensity, as if trying to erase the memories of that night with equations and theories. I found myself lost in thoughts, reliving every detail, every sensation, searching for a rational explanation for what we had experienced. But there was no logic that could dispel the terror we felt. Weeks later, I crossed paths with Rashid on campus. His gaze met mine for a brief moment, and in it, I saw recognition and fear. He quickly averted his eyes and walked away, as if speaking about that night might invoke whatever it was we had encountered. The university horror stories that once entertained us now seemed pale in comparison to our own experience. On the rare occasions when we gathered, the heavy silence among us spoke louder than any words. Alice's Yorkshire, once so lively, now rarely left her side, as if wanting to protect her from an invisible danger. As I write this account, part of me still wonders if we will ever fully understand what happened that night. The shadows seem deeper now, the dark corners more threatening. Every creak in the ceiling makes me look up with a racing heart. Our experience has become one of the true university ghost stories, whispered in the corridors and dorms, a somber reminder that there are things in this world that defy comprehension. And as university life goes on around me, I know I will never look at a ceiling the same way again, always wondering what might be lurking on the other side. It was a dark and stormy night, and I, John, was sitting in front of the fireplace in my family's wooden cabin, located deep within a secluded forest. The flames danced, casting eerie shadows on the walls, while the wind howled around the cabin, making the trees creak and groan. My family had inherited this long-forgotten cabin from a distant relative, and we were spending an extended weekend exploring the area. This particular day had been rainy and gray, keeping us from enjoying the outdoors. Instead, we spent the day playing board games and telling stories around the fireplace. Now, at night, the storm had subsided, but the atmosphere remained gloomy and unnerving. As I watched the flames dance, my mind returned to the scary stories my older sister Sarah had told earlier. Her words still echoed, bringing a growing sense of unease. She had spoken in detail about local legends, especially one about a mysterious creature known as the Wanderer. According to Sarah, this sinister figure, tall and slender, with a pale face and deep-set eyes, roamed the forest on stormy nights, seeking lost travelers or unsuspecting children. It was said that he could hypnotize his victims with a mere glance, leading them to an unknown fate. As the night progressed, the sounds of the storm lessened, but a new sound emerged, the sound of branches snapping under cautious feet. I froze, wondering if it could be a wild animal wandering too close to our cabin. My heart raced as I heard deliberate steps approaching the cabin. The rain started to fall again, pounding on the cabin's windows. The steps outside ceased, but my alert remained. My heart hammered as I searched for something to use as a weapon. I found a piece of firewood next to the fireplace and gripped it tightly, ready for whatever might come. Suddenly, a pale face appeared at the window, its deep-set eyes fixed on me. My blood ran cold in my veins as I recognized the figure from the legendary Wanderer. His face was partially obscured by the darkness, but I could see his eyes shining with an odd light. He seemed to be hypnotizing me, and for a moment I felt an inexplicable pull to open the door and let him in. I forced myself to look away, breaking eye contact. I knew I shouldn't invite a stranger in, especially one as sinister as he was. My breath became shallow as I wondered what he wanted. The rain continued to fall, as if hiding his steps as he circled the cabin. "Who are you?" I asked, my voice sounding braver than I felt. "What do you want?" There was no response, only the sound of the rain and the wind howling around the cabin. My heart hammered in my chest as I stood up, holding the firewood tightly. I slowly walked towards the door, determined to face whatever was out there. "I know you're there," I shouted, my voice sounding firm despite my fear. "Show yourself." My hand trembled as I turned the doorknob and flung the door open. The rain fell on me, but I barely noticed it. On the porch there was only darkness and the rain pounding. The Wanderer had disappeared. My relief was short-lived, as a sense of imminent danger still lingered. I stepped back inside, locking the door behind me. My heart was still racing as I wondered about the strange figure's intentions. "John, what are you doing?" Sarah's voice sounded from behind me. I turned to see her standing on the stairs, her eyes wide with sleep. "Why did you open the door?" I thought I saw something," I stammered, still dazed by the encounter. Sarah yawned and rubbed her eyes. "You probably saw an animal," she said, descending the stairs. "Don't worry, it's just the rain playing tricks on your imagination." I tried to calm my racing heart, convincing myself that she was right. I went back to the living room, where the fireplace still crackled, and sat down, trying to warm myself. Sarah joined me, wrapping herself in a blanket. "You should go to sleep," she suggested, yawning again. "It's been a long day, and tomorrow is another." I nodded, still a bit reluctant to leave the safety of the fireplace, but Sarah was right. I needed to try to rest. I got up, stretching my tense muscles, and climbed the stairs to the bedroom that Sarah and I shared. I lay in bed, pulling the covers up to my chin. The rain was still tapping on the windows, creating a soothing melody. My encounter with the Wanderer seemed like a distant dream, and I wondered if I had imagined it all. As I was about to fall asleep, I heard a soft sound coming from outside the cabin. My eyes widened in the darkness, and my heart began to race again. The sound came again, the sound of something being dragged across the floor. I froze, listening intently. Sarah's breathing beside me was calm and steady, indicating she was deeply asleep. My eyes adjusted to the darkness, but I couldn't see anything beyond the shadows dancing on the walls. Then, I saw a figure moving outside the window. My body went rigid as I recognized the tall and slender figure of the Wanderer. He seemed to be looking directly at me, his eyes shining in the darkness. A wave of fear washed over me, leaving me unable to move or scream. The Wanderer raised his hand, pointing at the window. I felt an irresistible urge to open the window and let him in. My body moved on its own as if under the control of an unknown force. As soon as the window was opened, the Wanderer smiled, revealing a disproportionately large mouth. His smile was sinister, and I felt a chill down my spine. "John!" Sarah's scream snapped me back to reality. She shook my shoulder, her eyes wide with fear. "You're scaring me. Close the window right now." Confused, I looked at the window, and then everything clicked into place. It wasn't the Wanderer. It was just the rain and shadows playing tricks on my imagination. I felt relieved, but also a bit embarrassed. Sarah gave me a concerned look, and then smiled gently. "It's okay," she said, shrugging. "I guess the story of the Wanderer got us a little paranoid. Let's try to get some sleep, all right?" I nodded, closing the window tightly. The rain continued to fall, but now it felt comforting instead of threatening. I turned onto my side, facing the wall, and tried to calm my mind. The next day, when the sun shone through the windows, the cabin felt like a completely different place. We went out to explore the forest, and I felt foolish for being so scared the night before. However, as we were heading back to the cabin, something caught my attention. An old, half-hidden tombstone among the vegetation. I approached it, brushing away leaves and cobwebs. My heart stopped when I read the inscription. "Here lies the Wanderer, friend of children, an unsolved mystery." My mind went back to the previous night, and I wondered if there was more to the legend than I thought. Perhaps there was truth to the scary stories after all. The digital clock blinked 11:47 p.m. as I entered the campus recording studio. The air was heavy with anticipation and a hint of anxiety. I, Jennifer, Jen Ling, and Kimberly had planned this night for weeks, determined to complete our audio assignment for the sound production course. The campus was deserted, our presence authorized as a rare exception. "Ready for an all-night recording session, guys?" I asked, trying to inject some enthusiasm into my voice. Jen Ling nodded, her eyes already fixed on the complex control panels. Kimberly, on the other hand, looked hesitant. "Are you sure it's a good idea to stay here all night, Elliot?" Kimberly questioned, her gaze wandering to the shadows in the corners of the room. I understood her apprehension. The campus at night had a completely different atmosphere, almost oppressive in its silence. Ignoring the discomfort that was starting to settle in, we dove into our work. Kimberly entered the soundproof recording room, while Jen Ling and I positioned ourselves in the control room. The hours dragged on, punctuated by frustrating attempts and endless adjustments. It was around 3 a.m. when things started to get strange. The white noise that persisted in our recordings was inexplicable. The recording room was supposed to be a sanctuary of silence, but something was interfering. A ghostly static that refused to leave us alone. "Let's try one more time," I insisted, my eyes burning from exhaustion. Kimberly returned to the recording room, her face a mask of exhaustion. Jen Ling, always methodical, adjusted the levels for the umpteenth time. When the recording ended, a chill ran down my spine. Something was different this time. Jen Ling, her eyes wide, made a frantic gesture for Kimberly to get out of the recording room. Confused, I leaned in to listen to the playback. That's when I heard it. A female voice, soft and ethereal, singing a Japanese melody that seemed to come from another era. My blood ran cold. This can't be possible," I murmured, my mind struggling to process what was happening. Kimberly burst into the control room, her face pale. "Did you hear that?" she whispered, her eyes wide with fear. No one answered. There was no need to. The terror on our faces said it all. Without a word, we started gathering our things. The work could wait. At that moment, we just wanted to get out of there as fast as we could. As we rushed through the empty corridors of the campus, I couldn't stop thinking about the mysterious voice and the feeling that we had somehow awakened something that should have remained dormant. We rushed out of the building, the cold morning air hitting us like a slap in the face. The campus, normally a place of comfort and familiarity, now felt like a maze of shadows and secrets. Our footsteps echoed on the empty sidewalks, each sound amplified by the oppressive silence of the night. "What the hell was that?" Kimberly asked, her voice trembling. No one answered immediately. What could we say? We had just experienced something that defied any rational explanation. Jen Ling, always the voice of reason, tried to calm the situation. There must be a logical explanation. Maybe some audio file accidentally mixed with our recording. But the tremor in her voice betrayed her own uncertainty. We decided to seek refuge in my dorm room, which was closer. As we walked, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. The dark windows of the building seemed like vigilant eyes tracking our every move. Upon reaching my room, I locked the door with a momentary sense of relief. The familiar surroundings of the dorm offered a false sense of security. Kimberly threw herself on my bed, hugging a pillow as if it were a shield. Jen Ling sat stiffly in the desk chair, her fingers nervously tapping on the wooden surface. "Look," I began, trying to sound more confident than I felt. "There's probably a perfectly normal explanation for this. We were all exhausted. Our minds play tricks when we're tired." My words sounded hollow even to myself. Kimberly shook her head vehemently. "No, Elliot. We all heard it. It was real." It was, as if something was trying to communicate with us. A chill ran down my spine as I heard her words. The idea that something supernatural might be trying to reach us was too terrifying to contemplate. I tried to push the thought away, but it persisted, like an echo of that strange melody. We stayed awake for the rest of the night, none of us daring to sleep. As if afraid of what our dreams might bring, we spoke in hushed tones, trying to rationalize what we had experienced. But our theories grew more absurd as the night wore on. It was around 5 a.m. when the silence was broken by a sound that made my heart almost stop. The keyboard in the corner of the room, which I hadn't even remembered turning on, started playing by itself. The melody was familiar, painfully familiar. It was the same Japanese song we had heard in the studio. Kimberly let out a muffled scream. Jen Ling froze. And I simply couldn't move. We stood there, petrified, as the supernatural serenade filled the room, its soft notes carrying an indescribable sadness and threat. The keyboard continued its sinister tune, the notes of the melancholy Japanese song dancing in the air like spectral sounds. My eyes, wide with terror, fixed on the instrument that had come to life. Kimberly sobbed silently, while Jen Ling, always the bravest of us, finally broke the trance. "This has to stop," he murmured, standing up with trembling determination. With hesitant steps, she approached the keyboard. Her hand hovered over the power button for a moment that felt like an eternity. When she finally pressed it, the silence that followed was almost deafening. The relief lasted only a moment. Soon, an ethereal voice filled the room, singing the same melody the keyboard had played. It was as if the air around us had turned into a supernatural conductor of sound. Kimberly screamed, her terror echoing off the dorm room walls. "We need to get out of here now," I exclaimed, my voice choked with fear. I grabbed my backpack and car keys, frantically gesturing for my friends to follow me. We ran through the dorm corridors, our hurried steps reverberating in the pre-dawn silence. When we reached the parking lot, the first light of dawn was tinging the sky with a pale pink. I got into the car with trembling hands, barely managing to fit the key into the ignition. Jen Ling and Kimberly huddled in the back seat, their pale faces reflected in the rearview mirror. "Where are we going?" Kimberly asked, her voice still trembling. "Anywhere away from here," I replied, speeding out of the campus. The deserted streets welcomed us, the world still asleep, oblivious to the terror we had faced. We drove for hours, the silence in the car broken only by occasional sobs from Kimberly. When we finally stopped at a gas station on the outskirts of town, the sun was already high in the sky. "What do we do now?" Jen Ling asked, her voice laden with exhaustion and fear. I looked at my friends, their faces marked by fatigue and the terror of the previous night. "We can't go back," I said firmly. "Not yet, at least." At that moment we made a silent decision. We would abandon the semester, our lives on campus, everything. The terror we had experienced was greater than any academic obligation. As the sun rose in the sky, illuminating the world with its comforting light, we made a pact. We would never return to that recording room. We would never spend another night on campus. And above all, we would never speak of what happened on that terrifying night. But even as we planned our future away from there, I couldn't shake the feeling that the mysterious voice we had heard, the song that had haunted us, was somehow more than just a supernatural occurrence. Looking at the horizon, I realized that some questions are better left unanswered. Some real university horror stories are truly terrifying not because of what they reveal, but because of what they leave in the shadows of uncertainty. Months passed since that fateful night on campus. Jen Ling, Kimberly, and I went our separate ways, each of us trying to forget the terror we had experienced. But fear, like a persistent shadow, followed us. I found myself in a small coastal town working at a local music store. The irony wasn't lost on me being surrounded by musical instruments. Daily was both a comfort and a constant reminder of that terrifying night. One quiet afternoon, as I was organizing some sheet music, an elderly customer walked into the store. Her name was Sakura, and she exuded an aura of ancient wisdom. As she browsed through some classical Japanese sheet music, something in her gaze made me pause. "Have you heard the Song of Regret?" she asked softly, her eyes meeting mine. My heart raced. "What song?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. Sakura started humming softly, and I felt my blood turn cold. It was the same melody that had haunted us on campus. "It's an old lament song," Sakura explained, noticing my reaction. "Sung by women who lost their loved ones in the war. It is said that their voices still echo in places where sorrow and regret are strong." Her words unleashed an avalanche of emotions and memories. The post-war campus could have been the site of untold tragic stories that were never shared. "Sometimes," Sakura continued, "restless spirits seek young ears to share their stories, not out of malice, but out of a deep longing to be remembered." That night I called Jen Ling and Kimberly. It was the first time we spoke about the incident since we parted ways. I shared what Sakura had told me, and together we began to process our experience under a new light. We realized that our terror was not the result of a malevolent presence, but an unexpected encounter with the painful past of the place. The campus, with its haunted university stories, was a repository of intense memories and emotions. Gradually, the fear that had consumed us began to transform into a deeper understanding. We weren't victims of a supernatural horror, but witnesses to a long-forgotten lament. We decided then to honor that experience, not with fear, but with respect. We started researching the history of the campus, uncovering stories of loss and resilience that had never been told. Today, years later, I still get goosebumps when I hear certain melodies. But it's no longer a paralyzing terror. It's a reminder that the stories of the past sometimes need to be heard, even if they scare us at first. Our real university horror story taught us that not all scary stories have villains. Sometimes, they are just echoes of past sorrows, seeking understanding in the present. And so our tale of terror transformed into one of comprehension and growth. The shadows of the campus, once terrifying, are now a reminder of the complexity of human history and the importance of listening, even when what we hear scares us. It was a cold and gloomy Sunday night, straight out of a horror story, with crackling fireplaces and shadows dancing to the sound of the howling wind. This atmosphere fascinated me, but it also stirred a deep fear within me. My name is Ezekiel, an unusual name inherited from my grandfather, and from an early age, I was haunted by horrifying nightmares. Shadow creatures with sharp claws and gleaming eyes relentlessly pursued me. My mother, witnessing my constant terror, decided to take action to comfort me. "Ezekiel, my dear, I have something special for you." Her voice sounded gentle and full of promise one night as she entered my room with an excited gleam in her eyes. In the palms of her hands she held a cloth monster with expressive eyes and a wide mouth full of pointed teeth. "This is your new friend, Ikbar Beaglesteiner," she explained, handing him to me. "He's here to keep you safe from the creatures of darkness that haunt you." I was intrigued by the peculiar doll, its mischievous smile and unique appearance. Instantly, I felt braver with him by my side. "Thank you so much, Mom." I expressed my gratitude, hugging the doll tightly. "I'll take good care of him, and together we'll face my fears." That night, I fell asleep quickly, feeling protected with Ikbar by my side. To my surprise, I wasn't tormented by any nightmares. I woke up renewed and grateful for the presence of my cloth guardian. I took Ikbar with me wherever I went, and he became my constant companion. People looked at us with curiosity and perhaps even a bit of envy, as Ikbar was truly one of a kind. As the days turned into weeks, I began to notice something unusual. At night, as the moon shone through my bedroom window, Ikbar seemed to take on a slightly different appearance. His eyes seemed to glow with a light of their own, and his pointed teeth looked even more menacing. Sometimes I'd wake up in the middle of the night and find him sitting in a corner of the room, his eyes fixed on me with an indecipherable expression. The relationship between Ikbar and me deepened, shrouded in an air of mystery. One night, I suddenly awoke, sensing an enigmatic presence in my room. My heart pounding, I looked around, feeling that something was amiss. Ikbar, my faithful guardian, was not in his usual spot next to my bed. Then my eyes fell upon a hooded figure silently sitting by the window. "Who are you?" My voice sounded hesitant as I sat up in bed, staring at the enigmatic figure. The figure rose gracefully, revealing a tall and slender silhouette. "I am the reason the shadow creatures no longer disturb your sleep, Ezekiel," a deep, reverberating voice said. "I am the guardian of your peaceful nights, protecting you from the nightmares that haunted you." I stood frozen, unable to articulate any words. The figure approached, its eyes shining beneath the hood. "I am the embodiment of your fear, but also of your courage," the figure continued. "And now, it's time to seal a pact." My mind was confused, trying to comprehend the unusual situation. "A pact?" I stammered, uncertain about what was happening. The figure extended its hand, revealing a small wooden box adorned with intricate symbols. "Ikbar needs sustenance to continue protecting you," the figure explained. "And that sustenance is the toys of other children. He needs the joy and innocence they contain." I was shocked by the unusual request. "Toys from other children?" I questioned, incredulous. "But that's not right. How can I take their toys away?" The figure let out a low, mysterious laugh. "You will do what is necessary to maintain peace in your nights, Ezekiel. Ikbar is the key to your tranquility, and he must be fed. It's a small sacrifice to keep the nightmares at bay." I hesitated, struggling with the idea of taking away something that brought joy to other children. But then I remembered the terror I felt before Ikbar came into my life. "What do I need to do?" I asked, my voice carrying a mix of curiosity and reluctance. The figure explained that I should obtain the toys in some way, whether through trades, purchases, or even findings. But remember, the figure warned, if you reveal anything about me or about Ikbar to anyone, the pact will be broken, and the consequences will be unpredictable. I slowly nodded, feeling the weight of the pact on my shoulders. I'll do what I can to keep Ikbar satisfied. I agreed, aware of the responsibility I now carried. The figure turned and disappeared into the darkness, leaving me alone with my tangled thoughts. I knew I had made an unusual pact, but I also knew that Ikbar's presence was essential to keep the shadows of fear at bay. The next day, I woke up with a sense of determination. I knew I had to fulfill my part of the pact to keep Ikbar content and ensure the nightmares didn't return, so I began to devise a plan to obtain toys from other children. I spent the following days observing children playing in the park, trying to identify which toys they cherished the most. My heart was heavy, as I didn't want to take away their joy, but I was constantly reminded of my purpose. One afternoon, while watching a boy playing with a race car, I had an idea. I approached him and started a conversation, praising the toy and expressing how much my younger cousin would love to have a car like that. To my surprise, the boy was thrilled with the idea of trading the car for a deck of cards I had brought with me. I was relieved that I didn't have to take the toy by force, and the boy seemed genuinely happy with the exchange. I returned home with the race car in my backpack, feeling a mix of conflicting emotions. That night, when the moon was high in the sky, I went to the room where Ikbar stayed. I placed the toy in the wooden box the mysterious figure had left, and carefully closed the lid. Ikbar seemed livelier than ever, his eyes glowing with an odd light. "You've done well, Ezekiel," Ikbar said, his voice sounding deeper than I remembered. "The joy and innocence contained in this toy will give me strength to continue protecting you." I shuddered at Ikbar's words, realizing that our pact was real and carried consequences. In the following days, I continued to collect toys from other children, always ensuring a fair trade. But as time passed, I began to notice something strange. The children whose toys I had taken seemed sadder and more withdrawn. Some even fell ill, and I couldn't help but wonder if there was a connection to the toys I had taken from them. My heart grew heavy with the possibility that I was causing them suffering. Troubled by the impact my actions were having on the other children, I decided to confront Ikbar. One night when the moon was full and bright, I called upon him in my room. "Ikbar, I need to understand," I began, my voice trembling. "Why are the other children sad and sick? Does it have something to do with the toys I took from them?" Ikbar materialized before me, his eyes glowing with an enigmatic light. "You made a pact, Ezekiel," he said, his voice sounding like a whisper in the wind. "The joy and innocence contained in those toys are my sustenance, but they also bring consequences for those who lost them." I was shocked by the revelation. "But I just wanted to get rid of the nightmares," I murmured, feeling guilty. "I didn't want to hurt anyone." Ikbar moved closer, his presence filling the room. "You must understand, Ezekiel, that actions have consequences," he said. "The joy was taken from them, and it affected their vitality. But know that, at the same time, you strengthened me to keep you safe." I felt a lump in my throat, realizing the true cost of our pact. "So, what should I do now?" I asked, desperate for a solution. "I don't want to see anyone suffering because of me." Ikbar hesitated, his expression turning somber. "You must decide, Ezekiel," he said. "You can choose to undo the pact, but know that the consequences may be terrible. The nightmares may return, and the shadow creatures may find their way back into your mind." I stood paralyzed, struggling with the difficult decision that needed to be made. On one hand, I didn't want to cause more suffering to anyone, but on the other hand, the fear of the nightmares and shadow creatures haunted me. I spent the next few nights in agony, debating internally about what to do, until, finally, I made a decision. I called upon Ikbar once more, and with a heavy heart I told him that I wanted to undo the pact. "I can't continue causing suffering to other children," I declared. my voice firm. "Even if it means facing my fears again." Ikbar looked at me with an indecipherable expression. "So be it," he said. "But remember, the consequences will be yours to bear." That night I returned the toys to the children, explaining what I had done and asking for forgiveness. They were happy to have their toys back, but also confused by my actions. In the following days, I felt inner peace for having done the right thing, but at night, when darkness fell, the nightmares returned with full force. The shadow creatures crawled back into my mind, and I woke up drenched in sweat and terror. However, over time, I realized that I was facing my fears. The nightmares still came, but I was learning to confront them, and eventually, the shadow creatures began to disappear, one by one. It was a chilly Saturday night, around 9 p.m. My name is Walker, and I was walking alone through the streets of Manhattan, heading home after a long day at work. The cold breeze cut through my face, and my footsteps echoed on the deserted sidewalks. It seemed like any other night. I had left the office a bit later than usual, so the streets were empty, with only a few cars passing by occasionally. As I walked with my hands in the pockets of my coat, a sense of being watched crept over me. I looked around, but the streets were deserted. I shook my head, trying to dismiss the paranoia, and continued on my way. It didn't take long for me to reach my apartment building. As I stepped inside, I took off my coat and hung it on the rack by the door. That's when I noticed something inside the pocket. I felt the soft fabric of what seemed to be a black hoodie, folded meticulously. How had it gotten there? I unfolded the hoodie and examined it more closely. It was plain black, with no logo or design. It had a hood, which set it apart from regular sweatshirts. I tried it on and was surprised at how well it fit. The fabric was incredibly soft and cozy, as if it had been tailor-made for me. I couldn't recall where the hoodie had come from. Initially, I thought about throwing it away, assuming it belonged to someone in my building. But then, something inside me made me want to keep it. It was as if a voice in my head convinced me that I needed this piece of clothing. I couldn't explain the connection I felt with this hoodie. It seemed silly to think that a simple piece of clothing could have any sort of power over me. But it was as if it awakened something within me. In the following days, I found myself wearing the hoodie more and more. I felt a growing confidence, a boldness I had never experienced before. The hood gave me a sense of anonymity, as if I could hide from the world while observing everything around me. I started wearing it when I went out at night, walking through the deserted streets, feeling a sense of power I had never known before. My friends noticed the change. "Dude, you're different," Mark said during our poker game. "What happened? You seem more intense." I smiled evasively. How could I explain the influence of a simple hoodie? Something told me they wouldn't understand. One day, while wearing the hoodie, I got into an argument with a man who bumped into me. Instead of apologizing, I felt a surge of overwhelming anger. Before I knew it, I pushed him with such force that he fell to the ground. I was shocked at my own reaction. The man got up, enraged, and glared at me. "What the hell was that, man?" he shouted. "I'm sorry," I muttered, feeling a mix of conflicting emotions. Part of me wanted to walk away, while another part wanted to continue the confrontation. This wasn't a normal reaction for me, and I knew it. I was intrigued and, at the same time, scared of the intensity of my own aggression. In the following days, I found myself reflecting on that incident, trying to understand what had happened. That's when I started to notice other changes in myself. My thoughts seemed darker, more intense. I felt a growing disregard for the consequences of my actions, as if the normal rules of society didn't apply to me. The hoodie had become a sort of armor, giving me a sense of invincibility. One night, I went for a walk, wearing the hood to shield myself from the light rain that was falling. As I walked through the dark streets, I felt an irresistible urge. I saw a solitary figure ahead, a man walking towards his car. Without thinking twice, I followed my impulse and attacked. I opened the car door, pulled the man out. The feeling of power was indescribable. The man pleaded for mercy, dazed, begging me to stop, but I couldn't. It was only when I heard the sound of approaching footsteps that I snapped out of it and ran away. I ran through the streets, breathless, my heart pounding. What had I done? I felt a mix of conflicting emotions: excitement, fear, and confusion. I hid in an alley, trying to catch my breath and make sense of what had happened. The following days were filled with constant anguish. I knew what I had done was wrong. The hoodie, once a comfort, had now become the tangible symbol of the darkness within me. I decided I had to get rid of it. I put it in a bag and walked to a nearby river. I stood at the water's edge, hesitant. "What are you doing, Walker?" I asked myself. "You can't just throw it away." My heart was heavy as I looked at the black fabric, now crumpled inside the bag. I felt a reluctance to part with it, as if we were somehow connected, but I knew it had to be done. I threw the bag into the river, watching it float briefly before sinking into the dark waters. I felt a weight being lifted from my shoulders, but also a void. It was as if I had separated myself from a part of me that I didn't understand and feared. In the days that followed, I reflected on my experiences. I spoke with a therapist, trying to understand the source of my repressed aggression. Gradually, I began to accept that there were dark aspects to my personality, which the hoodie had amplified and brought to the surface. Over time, I learned to manage these impulses and to understand that they didn't define me. That hoodie became a reminder that we all have dark sides, but we are responsible for our actions and for seeking help when needed. It was a night like any other. My name is Zach, and I was in my workshop working on some comic book art when my friend Neil dropped by. Neil and I had been friends for years, sharing a love for comic books and all things supernatural. He often kept me company while I worked. "What do you think of this?" Neil asked, placing a pizza box on the table. "Just picked it up, still hot." I thanked him and took a slice. As I ate, I continued working on a particularly tricky panel. Something about the pizza tasted a little off, but I couldn't quite pinpoint what it was. "Dude, you won't believe what happened to me today," Neil said, his face lit with excitement. "You know how I love exploring abandoned places, right? So today, I ventured into an old sanitarium outside of town." Neil went on to recount his adventure, describing the decaying corridors and empty rooms of the sanitarium, but something about his demeanor seemed off. His eyes were a bit glassy, and his voice sounded somewhat mechanical. "And guess what I found there?" he asked, his voice taking on a strange, sharp edge. "There were some old medical records, and one of them mentioned a patient named Zalgo. The way he was described, it was as if he were some sort of supernatural entity." A growing sense of unease settled over me. The pizza wasn't sitting well in my stomach, and Neil's account of the sanitarium left me uneasy. "Neil, you seem a bit different," I said, setting the pizza aside. "Are you sure you're okay?" He gave me a vacant stare, his eyes seeming to bore into my soul. Then he smiled, but there was something sinister in that smile. "Of course, I just got a little fascinated with the story of Zalgo, that's all. But let's get back to what you were doing." I nodded, though a voice in my head told me to stay alert. I continued working on the comic, but I couldn't fully concentrate. Something about the night felt out of the ordinary. As the night progressed, the comic book art I was working on began to take shape. The story revolved around a detective investigating a series of mysterious disappearances. However, the more I drew, the more the images seemed distorted. "Dude, these panels are getting dark," Neil commented, looking over my shoulder, "especially this one. It looks like those tentacles are moving." I looked at the panel I was working on. He was right. The tentacles, which had started as simple sketches, now appeared to be writhing on the page as if they were alive. A sense of unease settled in my stomach. "I think I need some air," I said, setting down my drawing pen. "I'll be right back." I stepped out of my workshop, breathing in the fresh night air. The moon was full and shone brightly, casting an eerie light on the world. I walked a bit, trying to calm my troubled mind. That's when I heard the sound of a motorcycle approaching. A biker rode past me, his eyes passing over me like two empty black holes. A chill ran down my spine, and I quickened my steps back to the workshop. "Where'd you go?" Neil asked when I returned. "Everything okay?" I shook my head, trying to shake off the image of the biker's eyes. Just needed some fresh air. These stories of sanitariums and supernatural entities are getting to me. Neil smiled, but there was something sinister in his smile. You should hear some more. I've got some bone-chilling true stories to tell. I think I've had enough horror stories for one day, I replied, trying to make a joke. But as the night wore on, the stories Neil told grew darker and more disturbing. My stomach churned from the pizza that now clearly seemed spoiled, and the images in my comic seemed increasingly corrupted. The night turned into a race against time as events took an even more sinister turn. My wife, Kate, who was pregnant, went into labor. We rushed to the hospital, leaving Neil behind, still spinning his dark tales. The hospital felt like a place out of the ordinary, with its bright lights and empty corridors. Kate was taken to the delivery room, and I stayed by her side, holding her hand. "You're gonna be okay?" I whispered to her, as much to calm myself as to reassure her. A nurse entered, her eyes appearing strangely vacant in the fluorescent light. She checked Kate's vital signs and made some notes on her chart. "The baby's almost here," she said, her voice sounding oddly distant. "The doctor will be here shortly." The minutes dragged on as we waited. Kate squeezed my hand tightly, her face contorted in pain. I looked at her, my eyes drifting over her familiar features, and that's when I saw it. Her eyes, once brown, now appeared pitch black and empty, like dark holes in her head. A scream escaped my throat. I let go of her hand and backed away, my heart pounding. "What's wrong?" she asked, her voice filled with panic. "What's happening?" "Your eyes," I murmured, pointing at them. "There." The nurse approached, placing a gentle hand on my shoulder. "Sir, you need to calm down. It's normal for eyes to appear different during labor. The pressure can make the veins more visible." Her words did not comfort me. Something was very wrong. I could feel it in my bones. The doctor entered the room, his white coat splattered with blood. He smiled at us, but his eyes too seemed empty, like windows into the darkness. "All right, Mom," he said, his voice oddly cheerful. "Let's meet this baby." The baby cried when it was born, a sound that would normally be music to my ears. But as the doctor handed the baby to Kate, I saw that its eyes were completely black, like tiny bottomless pits. My heart hammered in my chest as I looked at the baby in Kate's arms. The delivery room seemed like a sinister, distorted place, with the figures around me resembling creatures from a nightmare more than humans. "What happened to him?" I whispered, pointing to the baby's eyes. "Why are they black?" The doctor and nurse exchanged a glance, their faces impassive. "Sometimes, babies' eyes can appear black right after birth," the doctor said, his voice oddly calm. "It's just a temporary ocular anomaly." But I couldn't convince myself. Something sinister was at play, and I was certain it was connected to the entity Neil had mentioned, Zalgo. "We have to get out of here," I murmured to Kate, moving closer to her. "Something's not right." She looked at me, her eyes now returning to their familiar brown. "What do you mean? What's going on?" "I can't explain it, but I feel like we're in danger," I said, picking up our older daughter, Diana, who was sitting by the bed, scared by the commotion. "Just trust me, and let's get out of here." We rushed out of the hospital, ignoring the protests of the medical staff. The baby cried in my arms, and Diana ran alongside us, her big eyes filled with fear. We got into the car and drove off, heading in the opposite direction of our home. "What's happening?" Kate asked, her voice filled with fear. "Why are we running?" "Neil mentioned an entity called Zalgo," I said, turning the car toward my parents' house. "I think he's connected to this somehow. Everyone we encountered today seemed possessed." Kate let out a moan, covering her mouth with her hand. "What are we going to do?" "We're going to my parents' place," I said, turning the car toward the remote location. "They live out of town, in a secluded area. It'll be harder for this thing to find us there." The drive was filled with tense silence, interrupted only by the occasional cry of the baby. I glanced in the rearview mirror several times, wondering if black eyes were watching us from the shadows. We arrived at my parents' house and rushed inside, locking the door behind us. I sighed in relief. "I think we're safe for now," I said, hugging Kate and the kids. But even as I spoke, a sense of unease lingered in my mind. The image of the black eyes haunted me, and I wondered if we would ever truly be safe from Zalgo. Since I was little, I've always had a very vivid imagination. My mind created monsters under the bed and sinister shadows in the corners of the room. But as I grew older, these ghostly figures became less frequent, and I learned to distinguish reality from imagination. Or so I thought. My name is Nick, and everything changed when I turned 8 years old. My parents decided I was ready to have my own room. At first, I was excited about the idea. Finally, I would have my own space, away from the noise and mess of my younger siblings. But as the moving date approached, a sense of apprehension started to settle in. The night before the move, I was lying in bed in the room I shared with my little brother when I heard a strange noise coming from the hallway. It sounded like something was crawling on the walls. I froze, afraid to move or make any sound that might attract whatever was out there. "Did you hear that?" I whispered to my brother, who was lying next to me. "What?" He yawned sleepily. "I didn't hear anything." I sighed, convincing myself that it must be just the house creaking. But as I turned to try and sleep, I felt a chill run down my spine. It was as if someone was watching me. I looked around, but the room was immersed in darkness, with only the faint moonlight coming through the window. "Good night, Nick," said my brother, turning to the other side. "Good night," I replied, though I knew sleep would elude me that night. The next day, I woke up to the sound of boxes being carried and furniture being moved. The move was in full swing. My parents were busy supervising everything, while my siblings ran around the house, excited about exploring the new neighborhood. "Come on, Nick, help carry your things," my dad called from the hallway. I reluctantly got up and started packing my things. I looked around the room that had been my refuge for so many years and felt a twinge of sadness. But at the same time, a sense of relief was also present. Maybe, in my new room, I could finally leave behind the fears of my childhood. My new room was small but cozy. It had a window that looked out onto the backyard, letting in plenty of light during the day. At night, the shadows took on shapes on the walls, creating ghostly figures that reminded me of my childhood fears. On the first night in my new room, I felt strangely alone. The house still smelled of boxes and fresh paint, and the silence was oppressive. I lay in bed, pulling the blanket up to my chin, and tried to convince myself that I was being silly. It was just a room. There was nothing scary about it, but as the night progressed, I started to hear strange sounds. First, it was a low creak, as if someone was walking on the wooden floor of the hallway. Then, I heard a whisper, as if someone was speaking softly outside my door. I sat up in bed, my heart racing, and listened intently. But as soon as I moved, the sounds ceased. "You must be imagining things, Nick," I told myself. "Go to sleep." But sleep wouldn't come. I lay there, listening to every little noise in the house, until I finally dozed off. That night, I had a disturbing dream. I was lying in my bed, paralyzed, while a dark figure approached. I couldn't see its face, but I felt its gaze fixed on me. A voice whispered in my ear, saying things I couldn't understand, but that filled me with deep fear. I woke up breathless and drenched in cold sweat. The full moon shone through the window, illuminating the room. I looked around, relieved to realize it had just been a dream. But then I heard a noise in the corner of the room. "Who's there?" I asked, my voice trembling. There was no answer, only silence. I got up from the bed, my heart pounding, and cautiously walked towards the corner. That's when I saw on the floor a crumpled piece of paper. I bent down to pick it up, feeling a chill run down my spine. With trembling fingers, I unfolded the paper and saw, written in capital letters, a single word: "Run." The next morning I woke up confused and disoriented. The sun shone through the window, and I felt momentarily relieved to have survived that terrifying night. But then, I remembered the paper and the enigmatic warning. Run. But from whom? From what? I got up from the bed, feeling the weight of the previous night on my shoulders. I walked to the bedroom door and cautiously opened it, half expecting to find someone on the other side. But the corridor was deserted, with only the morning sunlight streaming through the windows. "Good morning, Nick," my mother called from the kitchen. "Come have breakfast." "Coming," I shouted back, still a bit dazed. As I walked through the house, I felt watched. I looked over my shoulder, half expecting to see a dark figure approaching, but there was nothing, just the empty house. I sat down at the kitchen table, where my dad was reading the newspaper and my mom was making pancakes. "Did you sleep well in your new room?" my mom asked, placing a plate of pancakes in front of me. "Sort of," I replied hesitantly, reluctant to share my supernatural experiences. I heard some strange noises, but it must have been just the house settling. My dad looked up from the newspaper. "Yeah, old houses make strange noises, but if you hear anything concerning, let us know." I nodded, digging into my breakfast, but as I ate, I couldn't shake the thought of the paper and the feeling that something sinister was going on. Later that day, while unpacking boxes, I came across an old photo album. I flipped through the pages, looking at pictures from my childhood. Then, one particular photo caught my attention. It was a picture of me, at around 5 years old, lying in bed with a scared look on my face, as if I had seen a ghost. "What did you find there?" My older sister, Diana, looked over my shoulder. "Oh, just an old photo," I replied, quickly closing the album, but Diana had already seen it. "Wow, you look terrified. What happened?" I hesitated for a moment, struggling with the urge to share my fears. "I had a nightmare," I murmured, "but it was a long time ago." Diana smiled, but her eyes were full of compassion. "Well, I hope you don't have any more nightmares now that you're in your new room." I smiled back, but my heart was heavy. I knew that night had only been the beginning. Something sinister was happening, and I needed to figure out what it was before it was too late. As the days turned into weeks, my daily routine became increasingly familiar. During the day, I helped my parents with chores, explored the new neighborhood with my siblings, and tried to ignore the constant feeling that something was wrong. But at night, when the sun set and darkness enveloped the house, my fear returned with full force. Every night I fell asleep with the light on, afraid of what might happen if I let the darkness take over my room. And every morning I woke up with a distinct feeling that something or someone had been watching me while I slept. One night, after weeks of disturbed sleep, I decided to face my fears once and for all. I turned off the light and forced myself to lie in the darkness, listening to the familiar sounds of the house around me. The ticking of the clock on the wall seemed amplified, each small noise making my heart race. And just as I was about to fall asleep, I heard a noise in the corner of the room. It sounded like something was walking inside the walls. I sat up in bed, my heart pounding, and looked towards the sound. That's when I saw her. A tall, slender figure dressed in black was standing in the corner of the room, watching me. Her face was in shadow, but her eyes shone with a sinister light. I felt a chill run down my spine, and a deep fear settled within me. "Who are you?" I asked, my voice trembling. The figure didn't respond, but I could feel her presence filling the room. My heart raced even faster, and a cold sweat broke out on my spine. "What do you want from me?" I asked, my voice failing. The figure took a step forward, and for the first time I could see what was hidden in the shadows. Her face was a mask of terror, with empty eyes and a mouth twisted into an evil smile. I screamed, shrinking back into the bed, and the figure disappeared as if she had never existed. I sat there, trembling until my parents rushed into the room, alarmed by my scream. "Nick, what happened?" My mom hugged me while my dad turned on the light. I saw something," I stammered, still shaking. Something was here in the room. My parents looked at me with concern, but also with skepticism. "You must have had a nightmare," my mom said, stroking my hair. "Try to sleep now. Tomorrow is another day." I nodded, knowing they wouldn't believe me, but as I lay down looking at the corner of the room where the figure had appeared, I knew it hadn't been a dream. Something sinister was happening, and I needed to figure it out before it was too late. The years passed, and I grew into an adult. But the events of that haunted night still lingered in my memory. I moved out of my childhood home, went to college, started a career, got married, and had children. Yet, the darkness of the night sometimes brought flashbacks of the past. My heart would race, and I would feel the same sense of being watched. As I aged, I learned to cope with my fear. I understood that my childhood room wasn't cursed, nor was the house haunted. The problem was Memmy hyperactive imagination, my childish fears, and my tendency to see the supernatural where it didn't exist. However, the darkness of the night still brought a sense of apprehension. Sometimes I would catch myself looking over my shoulder, wondering if there was something lurking in the shadows. My children laughed at my ghost stories and hauntings, thinking I was making it all up. But I knew there was something more, something I couldn't explain. My interests changed over the years, and I became fascinated by the supernatural. I devoured books and documentaries about paranormal phenomena, and I became an active member of online forums where people shared their own inexplicable experiences. And as I learned more about the supernatural world, I realized I wasn't alone. There were others out there who had experienced similar things, people who had also seen dark figures, heard whispering voices, and felt the presence of the other world. I continued my search for answers over the years, a quest to understand what had happened that haunted night in my childhood. And although I never found definitive answers, I learned to accept the unknown and live with the mystery. My fear became a part of me, a constant reminder that there are more things between heaven and earth than we can explain. And at night, when the darkness envelops me once more, I smile, remembering that sometimes reality is far scarier than any ghost story. The wind howled outside, the dry leaves dancing a macabre waltz against the basement windows. I, at 15, was sitting on the cold concrete floor next to my best friend. Between us, illuminated by the flickering light of candles, lay a homemade Ouija board, crafted from cardboard and permanent markers. My younger sister, just 11 years old, watched from the corner, her eyes wide with a mix of fear and childlike curiosity. "Let's go," I called out, trying to sound confident. "It's just a silly game." But even as the words left my mouth, I felt a chill run down my spine. True Ouija board horror stories echoed in my mind, but I brushed them aside, determined to maintain my cool teenager facade. My friend and I placed our fingers on the makeshift planchette, a plastic bottle cap. We closed our eyes and started moving it in circles, chanting nonsensical words to set the mood. I couldn't help but let out a nervous giggle, and my friend joined in. My younger sister, however, remained silent, her fear almost palpable in the dense air of the basement. "Your turn," my friend said, opening his eyes. "Put your fingers here and ask a question." Reluctant, she moved closer, her trembling hands touching the planchette. "Is anyone there?" she stammered, her voice barely above a whisper. The silence that followed was deafening. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, without warning, the planchette began to move. Slowly, inexorably, it slid towards the yes written on the board. The shock froze us in place. I knew I hadn't moved the planchette. My friend, his eyes wide, shook his head. And my sister, well, she had already withdrawn her hands and recoiled, silent tears streaming down her cheeks. Panic took hold of us. In a sudden move, we crushed the homemade Ouija board, our trembling hands destroying our improvised creation. The true Ouija board horror stories I had heard online now came to life before our eyes, with our hearts racing. We rushed up the basement stairs, tripping over each other in our haste to escape that suffocating atmosphere. We reached the upper floor and were greeted by impenetrable darkness. The house lights, which should have been on, were all off. I tried to turn on the light switch, but nothing happened. A chill ran down my spine as I recalled the numerous true Ouija board horror stories I had heard. Was it possible that we were living one of them? With our arms wrapped around each other, we huddled in the center of the living room, forming a tight circle. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the sound of our rapid breathing and my younger sister's muffled sobs. The night shadows seemed deeper, more threatening. As we waited for our mother to return from her late shift, the stories of the Ouija board haunted us, each shadow potentially hiding something sinister. When the headlights of our mother's car finally illuminated the street, we rushed towards it, Before we could even speak, she must have noticed our panic, for she didn't ask any questions. We piled into the car, our bodies shaking uncontrollably. As we drove away from the house, our eyes darted to the windows, half expecting to see something following us. The Ouija board scary stories we had once considered mere fiction now gained a terrifying reality in our lives. With our mother's arms around us, we tried to calm down, but the stories of the Ouija board assombrado that we had just experienced were too fresh in our minds to be dismissed. The air in the car felt heavy, as if the very fabric of reality had been torn apart, revealing something sinister lurking in the shadows. The days that followed our Ouija board experience were a blur of unease. Although the acute terror had subsided, a constant sense of unease remained. We tried to resume our normal lives, but the weight of what we had witnessed lingered. Occasionally, we would catch a movement out of the corner of our eyes, only to turn and see nothing. The supernatural encounters we feared seemed to be lurking, waiting to manifest. One night, while studying in my room, I heard a thud coming from the hallway. I rushed out and came upon an inexplicable scene. The mirror that hung on the wall had fallen and slid more than 1.5 meters down the wall. I froze, recalling the bone-chilling Ouija board stories I had read online. My rational mind searched for a logical explanation, but the primitive fear I felt suggested something more sinister. Days later, as my friend visited me for the first time since the incident, we witnessed something even more disturbing. We were chatting in the living room when the empty computer chair, which had been still, started to spin slowly on its own. We locked eyes, his face reflecting the terror I felt. That thing was more than we could rationalize as a mere coincidence. The climax came when my friend, pale and trembling, confided something that had been haunting him since that night. He swore that, as we rushed up the basement stairs in our hasty escape, he had glimpsed a shadowy figure sitting at the top of the stairs, a presence that did not belong in this world, observing our flight with a morbid interest. These Ouija board scary stories we had experienced firsthand now haunted us day and night. My younger sister refused to be alone in any room of the house. I couldn't stop myself from constantly looking over my shoulder, expecting to see something that shouldn't be there. The feeling of being watched became a constant, unwanted companion. As the days passed, the unexplained events of the Ouija board seemed to lessen in frequency, but the fear remained. We learned the hard way that there are things in this world and, perhaps beyond it, that defy rational explanation. Our Ouija board experience had become a somber reminder, a cautionary tale we shared only in whispers. I never played with a Ouija board again. Some doors once opened are hard to close, and some true horror stories are lived, not just told. I'll never forget that fateful night. It was a regular Friday, and I, at 13, was excited about the pajama party at my best friend Lucas's house. We were 5 carefree teenagers, eager for fun and thrills. Little did we know that our lives were about to change forever. Lucas's room was cozy, decorated with rock band posters and illuminated by a soft light. Sitting on the floor of his room, we decided to try something different, a Ouija board. Lucas pulled it out from under his bed, blowing off a thin layer of dust. "Let's give it a try?" he asked with a mischievous smile. I hesitated for a moment. My grandmother was ill, battling an aggressive cancer, and it weighed on my mind. But teenage curiosity got the better of me. "Why not?" I replied, trying to sound nonchalant. We placed our hands on the planchette and started asking silly questions. After a few uneventful rounds, I felt an inexplicable urge. With my heart racing, I asked, "How much longer will Grandma be around?" The silence fell over us like a heavy mantle. The planchette started to move slowly, stopping at the number 2. I swallowed hard, trying to ignore the chill that ran down my spine. Disturbed by the answer and wanting to break the tension, I decided to do something bold. My Christian upbringing echoed in my mind, and before I could think better, I blurted out, "Is this board controlled by Satan?" The words came out as a challenge, but I barely had time to process what I just said. The very air in the room grew heavy, almost suffocating. I looked at my friends, their faces pale, and reflecting the fear I felt myself. "Let's count to 3 and release the planchette," I whispered, my voice shaking. 1, 2, 3. Our hands moved away from the Ouija board as if it were on fire. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, before our very eyes, the board itself began to move. It lifted slowly off the floor, rising to the height of our faces. We froze, unable to move or scream. The Ouija board began to spin in the air, faster and faster, becoming a blur. In a blink of an eye, the Ouija board shot towards me. By pure instinct, I dodged to the side, feeling the wind of its passing brush my face. I heard a loud crash as the board hit the wall behind me, falling to the floor with a dull thud. For long minutes none of us dared to move. The silence was broken only by our ragged breathing. Finally, mustering all the courage I had left, I approached the fallen board. My heart was pounding in my chest as I stared at the pointer firmly pointing to the word, "Yes." In that moment, I felt as if I had awakened something far beyond my comprehension. The hours that followed that terrifying experience with the Ouija board passed like a blur. None of us could sleep that night, remaining in silent vigil until dawn. When the first rays of sun finally pierced through the curtain slits, I felt a momentary relief, as if the light could chase away the shadows of the previous night. I went home that morning, carrying an invisible weight on my shoulders. I tried to convince myself that it was all just a bad joke or an elaborate trick, but something inside me knew we had witnessed something beyond human comprehension. The Ouija board's words echoed in my mind. 2 and yes, the day after that fateful night, my world came crashing down. I woke up to the sound of the phone ringing and my mother's muffled sobs. Even before she said anything, I knew. My grandmother had passed away during the early hours. Exactly 2 days after the Ouija board question, the realization hit me like a punch to the gut. The Ouija board had predicted with eerie accuracy. The Ouija board horror stories I used to hear as mere campfire tales now gained a terrifying dimension in my life. That Ouija board experience was no longer just a story. It was my reality, a supernatural encounter that changed my perception of the world forever. In the days following my grandmother's passing, I was immersed in a mix of grief and terror. The coincidences were too disturbing to ignore. The Ouija board had not only predicted her death, but also confirmed it was controlled by forces I dared not name. These Ouija board experiences had become a weight I carried in silence, fearing no one would believe me if I shared. At night, in my room, every shadow seemed to hide something sinister. The normal creaks of the house made me jump. Imagining paranormal manifestations, I started to avoid mirrors and dark corners, fearing to see something that shouldn't be there. My parents noticed my changed behavior but attributed it to the recent loss of my grandmother. Weeks passed, and although the acute terror had subsided, a constant sense of unease remained. I tried to distract myself with school and friends, but the memories of that night continued to haunt me. I searched for Ouija board true horror stories, finding numerous accounts of similar experiences to mine. Each story I read seemed to validate my fear, reinforcing the belief that we had indeed awakened something on that night. Over time, I learned to live with this new reality. I never touched a Ouija board again and warned my friends about the dangers of dabbling with the unknown. The experience taught me a valuable lesson about respecting the boundaries between our world and what may exist beyond it. Today, years later, I still shudder when I remember that night. The Ouija board scary stories are no longer just entertainment to me. They are a constant reminder of the inexplicable. I learned that there are mysteries in the universe that perhaps are better left unanswered, and that some doors, once opened, may not be easily closed. I've never been much of a believer in supernatural things, but that night in college changed everything. It was a regular Friday, and my roommate suggested we play with a Ouija board she had stashed away. "Come on, it'll be fun," she insisted, her eyes sparkling with excitement. Reluctantly, I agreed. After all, what could go wrong? It was just a game, right? We sat on the floor of our dorm room, the board between us, illuminated only by the faint light of a lamp. The air felt heavier, laden with anticipation. With our hands on the planchette, we started asking silly questions. "What will my next test score be?" my friend asked, laughing. The planchette moved slowly, pointing to the letter M. We laughed, thinking it was just our imagination. That's when something strange happened. Without us asking any question, the planchette started to move on its own. My heart raced as I realized it was spelling out a name. My boyfriend's name. "Stop it!" I exclaimed, thinking she was playing a prank. But the look of shock on her face told me she was as surprised as I was. The planchette continued to move, now forming a sequence of letters that made no sense. The air in the room felt denser, almost suffocating. My roommate and I exchanged glances, a mix of fear and curiosity in our eyes. The planchette kept moving, alternating between my boyfriend's name and that strange, seemingly random sequence. "This is crazy," I murmured, my voice slightly shaking. Should we stop? But something inside me wanted to continue, to find out what this meant. My friend, sensing my hesitation, suggested, "What if we write down what's being spelled out?" With trembling hands, I grabbed a piece of paper and started to write my boyfriend's name, followed by that odd sequence. The planchette's movement was fluid, as if guided by an invisible hand. With each letter, I felt a chill running down my spine. The room seemed to have grown colder. I noticed my breath forming small clouds in the air. "Are you feeling this cold?" I asked my friend. She nodded, her eyes wide and fixed on the board. After what felt like an eternity, the planchette finally stopped. I looked at the paper in my hands, covered in notes. My boyfriend's name repeated several times, followed by that mysterious sequence. What message could be hidden there? With trembling hands, I picked up my phone. "I need to call him," I said to my friend, who just nodded, still in shock. I dialed my boyfriend's number, my heart pounding in my chest. When he answered, his voice sounded strange, distant. "Hi," he said, his tone flat. I swallowed hard and started to tell him about our Ouija board experience. As I spoke, I heard his breathing become heavier on the other end of the line. "Can you come over?" I asked, feeling an inexplicable urgency to show him what we had written. There was a long pause before he responded. "I'm coming." The tone of his voice left me even more apprehensive. Minutes later, which felt like hours, he arrived. His eyes were red and puffy, as if he had been crying. Without a word, I handed him the paper with the notes. He stared fixedly at the letters, his face visibly paling. This is impossible," he murmured, his voice barely audible. "It's a message from my grandmother. She passed away today. This sequence, it's words in our familiar dialect. She's saying goodbye." A heavy silence filled the room. My mind struggled to process what I had just heard. The Ouija board, in some inexplicable way, had conveyed a real message, a message from someone who had just passed away. I'm so sorry," I stammered, not knowing what else to say. My boyfriend sat on the edge of the bed, the crumpled paper in his trembling hands. Silent tears streamed down his face as he read the message over and over. My friend, still visibly shaken, broke the silence. "How is this possible? How can we have received a message in a language we don't know?" The question hung in the air with no answer. None of us had a logical explanation for what had happened. The rest of the night passed in a blur of conflicting emotions. We comforted my boyfriend as best we could, while trying to make sense of our own swirling minds. The reality of what we had experienced was hard to accept, but impossible to deny. When the sun finally rose, illuminating the room with its soft light, I felt as if I had lived a lifetime in that single night. The Ouija board lay forgotten in the corner, a silent reminder that there is more between heaven and earth than our vain philosophy dreams. That experience changed my perception of the world and the mysteries it holds. Some questions, I realized, are better left unanswered. On that fateful night, fate led me to a solitary gas station on the side of the road. The air was heavy with palpable tension, as if the universe knew that something sinister was about to happen. I never imagined that a simple stop for gas would turn into one of the most terrifying experiences of my life. The fluorescent lights of the gas station flickered intermittently, casting unsettling shadows on the cracked asphalt. The silence was deafening, broken only by the occasional buzz of a nocturnal insect. As I filled up the tank, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. My eyes nervously scanned the perimeter of the station, searching for any suspicious movement. That's when I saw him for the first time. A gaunt, disheveled man emerged from the shadows, his eyes dull and lifeless, fixing on me with an unsettling intensity. My heart began to race, and I instinctively tightened my grip on the knife in my pocket. "Got any change?" he asked, his voice rough and raspy like sandpaper. I swallowed hard, trying to maintain my composure. "Sorry, I don't have any," I replied, avoiding direct eye contact. He didn't move, continuing to stare at me with those empty eyes. Time seemed to stretch as we remained in this silent impasse. Suddenly, a woman appeared beside him. Her face was weathered by time and addiction, a toothless smile sending shivers down my spine. They exchanged a complicit glance that made my blood run cold. In that moment, I knew I was facing a real danger, a horror that didn't come from urban legends or ghost stories, but from the raw cruelty of humanity. With trembling hands, I tried to start the car, but the engine only sputtered and failed. Panic began to take hold of me as I saw the couple slowly approaching. The woman with her demonic smile raised her hand, revealing a reflective object in the faint light of the gas station. My heart almost stopped when I realized it was a hunting knife, its blade glinting menacingly. "What's the rush, dear?" she asked in a voice too sweet for her terrifying appearance. The man in turn started to circle the car, his eyes never leaving mine. The reality of the situation hit me like a punch to the gut. He was trapped in a real-life nightmare, living through one of the true scary stories I had always feared. Desperate, I tried to start the car again. The engine finally caught with a roar, and I felt a momentary wave of relief. But before I could engage the gear, the man was already at my window, his face pressed against the glass. "Open the door," he ordered, his voice low and threatening. I could see the dirt encrusted under his fingernails as he tapped on the window. My mind raced, searching for an escape. I recalled the scary gas station stories I had heard, but none of them had prepared me for this. This was a real-life gas station horror, tangible and terrifying, and I was living every second of it. Adrenaline coursed through my veins as I struggled against the urge to panic. With a quick move, I floored the accelerator. The car lurched forward, barely missing the woman as she jumped out of the way at the last second. I heard a dull thud and a cry of pain. The man had been hit by the side mirror, but I didn't look back, focused only on fleeing that nightmare gas station. My heart was pounding like a runaway drum as I sped down the dark road, leaving the gas station and that terrifying couple behind. The dashboard lights cast an eerie glow on my pale, sweaty face. Every shadow on the road seemed like a threat, every curve a potential hiding spot for more horrors. The silence inside the car was broken only by the sound of my ragged breathing and the rumble of the engine. My mind replayed the events of the past few minutes incessantly. Those faceless man with his lifeless eyes and the woman with her demonic smile were burned into my memory. This night would surely become one of the true scary stories that people would tell. A vivid example of the actual scary encounters that can happen in the most mundane places. After a few kilometers, my nerves began to settle a bit, but the adrenaline still coursed through my veins. That's when I noticed something on the passenger seat out of the corner of my eye. My blood froze. There, glinting under the intermittent light of the road's poles, was the woman's knife. Somehow, during the confusion of my escape, it must have fallen into the car. Panic threatened to take hold of me again. What if they were following me? What if the police stopped me and found the knife? My mind conjured increasingly terrifying scenarios. This gas station terror had turned into a nocturnal pursuit, and I didn't know when or how it would end. Deciding to get rid of the evidence, I spotted a rest area ahead and decided to stop. With trembling hands, I grabbed the knife, being careful not to touch the blade. I got out of the car, nervously looking around. The area was deserted, only the distant sound of cars on the highway breaking the silence. I quickly threw the knife into the dense bushes next to the parking lot, praying it would never be found. Back in the car, I took a deep breath, trying to calm my still rattled nerves. The digital clock on the dashboard showed it was almost midnight. It had only been an hour since I stopped at that gas station, but it felt like an eternity had passed. I started the engine again and headed back on the road, determined to get home as fast as I could. With every mile that took me away from that nightmare gas station, I felt some of the weight being lifted from my shoulders, but I knew the memories of that night would haunt me for a long time. Finally, I spotted the familiar lights of my town. The streets were almost empty at that hour, and every shadow still made me jump. I pulled into my garage and locked the car, rushing inside the house. It wasn't until I shut and locked the front door that I allowed myself to relax a little. I sat on the couch, trembling as the reality of what had happened started to settle in. This wasn't one of the scary stories I used to read online. It was real. It had happened to me, and I could hardly believe I had survived. I had picked up my phone, thinking about calling the police. But what would I say? That I was attacked by a scary couple at a gas station and then threw away the only evidence I had? Not to mention that I had fled the scene. I decided that, for now, I would keep this terrifying gas station experience to myself. As I prepared for a sleepless night, I promised myself that I would never again stop at a gas station at night. This nocturnal terror experience had taught me a valuable lesson about the real dangers that can lurk in the most mundane places. Looking out the window at the dark street, I couldn't help but wonder how many other true and scary gas station stories are out there untold. How many people have gone through similar experiences and kept silent, afraid of not being believed. One thing was certain: I would never view a gas station the same way again. The fear of gas stations was now deeply ingrained in me, a constant reminder of the actual horrors that can happen when we least expect them. It was a Saturday night, almost 4 in the morning, when I decided to fill up my car before heading home. The sky was pitch black, and the city streets echoed the silence of the early hours. I pulled into my usual gas station not far from my parents' house, grateful for the absence of other vehicles. As I walked towards the building to pay, I noticed a hooded figure passing by me. The short man abruptly stopped and stared at me. I felt a chill run down my spine. "What's up?" I asked, continuing on my way. He remained silent, standing still like a statue. Inside the store, I paid for the gas and bought a lottery ticket, trying to ignore the unease growing in my chest. The attendant, with deep bags under his eyes, barely looked up at me. I went back outside to start filling up, my hands trembling slightly. I looked around, noticing the ghost town that Atlanta had become at this hour. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the metallic sound of the gas pump. I finished fueling quickly, eager to leave that desolate place. I got into the car, starting the engine with a sigh of relief. That's when I heard it, a subtle noise, almost imperceptible, coming from the back seat. My heart raced, and a cold sweat broke out on my temples. Slowly, I raised my eyes to the rearview mirror. My eyes widened in horror as I saw the hooded man's face staring at me from the back seat. A scream tore from my throat, echoing inside the vehicle. In a panic-stricken impulse, I slammed on the brakes, making the car skid to a sudden stop in the middle of the deserted street. "Get out! Get out of my car now!" I shouted, my body shaking uncontrollably. I flung open the doors in a desperate gesture and started screaming for help, hoping that someone in the nearby houses would hear me. "Someone help me! There's an intruder in my car." As if in response to my pleas, porch lights started to turn on, and I could hear doors opening. The hooded man hurried out of the car, his eyes flashing with anger. "I could have slit your throat," he rasped, his voice rough as sandpaper. Some people started coming out of their homes, drawn by the commotion. The intruder, realizing he was at a disadvantage, sprinted down the street, disappearing into the shadows of the early morning. I stood there, frozen, watching him vanish into the darkness. My body still trembling with adrenaline. Concerned neighbors approached, asking if I was okay. "I am now," I replied breathlessly, but there was a stranger in the back seat of my car. I briefly explained the incident, feeling the weight of the terror I had experienced. I thanked the people who came to help and decided to continue on my way home, still shaken by the incident. At every corner, every shadow cast by the streetlights, my heart raced. My eyes darted frantically around the streets, fearing to see the hooded face again. The rest of the drive was a blur of anxiety and constant alertness. When I finally pulled into my garage at home, I let out a long sigh of relief. I sat in the car for a moment, trying to process what had happened. I quietly entered the house, not wanting to wake my parents. In the dark living room, every shadow seemed to move. Every creak of the house made me jump. I turned on all the lights on my way to my bedroom, obsessively checking if the doors and windows were locked. Lying in bed, sleep wouldn't come. My mind replayed the events of the night incessantly. How had that man gotten into my car without me noticing? What did he intend to do? His words echoed in my head. I could have slit your throat. A chill ran through my body as I thought about what could have happened. That night, I vowed to myself that I would never again fill up alone in the middle of the night. The incident at the gas station had shown me how vulnerable we can be in seemingly safe places. The scary gas station stories I used to hear now took on a new perspective in my mind. Years have passed since that terrifying night, but the memories remain vivid in my memory. The gas station incident became a turning point in my life, making me reassess my nighttime choices and habits. One afternoon, while flipping through a local newspaper, I came across a headline that made my blood run cold. Gas station robbery spree terrifies community. The article detailed a series of crimes occurring in the same region where I had my scary encounter years ago. As I read, I recognized familiar patterns: a hooded figure, sneaky approaches, threats of violence. Every word transported me back to that night, reliving the terror I had felt. Could my aggressor have continued his criminal activities over the years? The episode I experienced has become part of a larger set of urban legends and true horror stories circulating around the city. Today, whenever I pass by a gas station at night, I can't help but shiver. The fluorescent lights, the silence of the early hours, it all takes me back to that fateful night. I have learned the hard way that true terror can be closer than we think, lurking in the most mundane places of our daily lives. My story has become a constant reminder that we must always be vigilant, even in the most unexpected moments and places. The rain pounded the asphalt as I gazed out the gas station windows. It was yet another lonely night on my second job, an overnight shift I took to supplement my income. The digital clock blinked 2:17 a.m. when the door chimed, signaling the arrival of a customer. A tall man, about 1.8 tm tall, with long wet hair drenched by the storm, staggered in. His eyes, unfocused, wandered around the store before settling on the beverage section. He grabbed a tall boy and approached the counter, leaving a trail of water on the floor. "Good evening," I greeted, trying to maintain calm in the face of his disturbing appearance. He stared at me for long seconds before mumbling, "What's your name?" I hesitated but replied, "Rob." "Rob," he repeated, letting out a strange laugh that sent chills down my spine. "I like that." He opened the can right there and took a long gulp, disregarding the store's rules. As he drank, I noticed his trembling hands and the strong smell of alcohol. He remained standing, drinking and mumbling to himself. The situation made me increasingly uncomfortable. "And what's your name?" I asked, trying to break the tense silence. He took a long time to respond, as if he had to invent a name. "Bob," he finally said with a crooked smile. "Where do you work, Bob?" I tried once more to strike up a conversation, hoping he would soon be on his way. His reaction scared me. A sudden, loud laugh echoed through the empty store. "Work," he snarled, his face contorting with anger. "The government took everything from me." I swallowed hard, regretting my question. But then, as quickly as it had come, the fury in his eyes faded. "I like you, Rob," he said, leaning over the counter. "You seem to know what you're doing." The enigmatic comment made my stomach churn. Something told me that this night would be different from the others. And I was right, terror was only beginning. The heavy silence that followed was interrupted only by the sound of the rain pounding against the gas station windows. Bob remained there, swaying slightly, his eyes fixed on me. Suddenly, he turned and staggered towards the aisles, muttering to himself. I tried to focus on other tasks, but I couldn't take my eyes off him. His presence was like a dark cloud hanging over the store. After a few minutes, he returned to the counter, this time with a somber expression on his face. "I did something very bad," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. My heart instantly raced. "What did you do, Bob?" I asked, dreading the answer. He leaned closer, the smell of alcohol almost suffocating me. "I need a place to hide," he mumbled, his eyes darting from side to side as if looking for invisible pursuers. Before I could react, Bob abruptly stepped back and disappeared down the corridor leading to the restrooms. I heard a door slam, and then silence. The minutes dragged on. The tension in the store was palpable. I alternated between glancing at the corridor and the front door, half expecting the police to show up at any moment. What had Bob done? Why did he need to hide? Suddenly, the lights flickered and went out, plunging the gas station into total darkness. My heart raced. With trembling hands, I grabbed the flashlight from behind the counter and pointed it down the restroom corridor. "Bob?" I called out, my voice barely audible. I didn't get a response. Slowly, I started to move towards the corridor. The restroom doors were ajar, and Bob was nowhere to be seen. I continued to the back door, my entire body tense with apprehension. That's when I heard Ida's soft dripping and the sound of wet shoes. I froze in my tracks, my blood turning cold in my veins. "Bob?" I whispered, barely able to get the words out. A sudden movement to my left made me spin around. The flashlight revealed Bob, his eyes wide and wild, his pupils dilated to the max. Before I could react, he lunged at me, screaming, "I'll kill you." Terror took over as I struggled to free myself from his grasp. Feeling his fingernails scratching my back, I managed to push him off and ran back to the front of the store, my heart pounding in my chest. This terrifying night at the gas station was far from over, and I feared what was yet to come. With my heart hammering in my chest, I ran to the front of the store. The sound of Bob's footsteps echoed behind me, mixing with the noise of the storm outside. I grabbed my raincoat and dashed out, the cold water hitting me like thousands of needles. Stumbling in the darkness, I managed to reach my car. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely hold the keys. I finally got in and locked the doors, panting. Through the fogged-up windshield, I saw Bob's silhouette at the entrance of the gas station, his distorted figure blurred by the torrential rain. With trembling fingers, I dialed 911. "Emergency, what's your problem?" The dispatcher's voice sounded distant amid the roar of the storm. "Please help," I stammered. "I'm at the gas station on Main Street. There's a man. He tried to attack me, and I think he did something terrible." "Stay calm, sir. The police are on their way. Are you in a safe place?" "Yes, I'm in my car, but he's out there. He said he did something very bad." The minutes that followed felt like an eternity. Bob remained standing at the entrance of the gas station, a sinister statue in the pouring rain. The rain eased and I could see his contorted face twisted with anger and despair. Finally, I heard the sirens. 2 police cars emerged on the road, their lights cutting through the darkness. Bob backed away into the gas station. The officers approached cautiously, weapons drawn. I got out of the car, trembling, and quickly explained the situation. They asked me to stay put while they went inside. Moments later, I heard shouts and sounds of a struggle. My heart leaped when I saw the officers dragging Bob out. He was fighting violently, his eyes wide and wild, his pupils dilated to the max. "He's completely drugged," I heard one of the officers say as they handcuffed him. As Bob was put into the squad car, one of the officers approached me. "We'll need your statement," he said, "but first, you need medical attention for those scratches." Only then did I notice the marks Bob had left on my back. The adrenaline was starting to wear off, and the reality of what had just happened hit me full force. This scary experience at a gas station will be forever etched in my memory. The true and scary gas station stories I used to hear now seemed terrifyingly real. As I was taken away in an ambulance, I vowed to myself that I would never work the night shift again. The nocturnal terror I had experienced at this gas station was more than enough for a lifetime. My name is Evelyn, and a few years ago, I lived through one of the most terrifying experiences of my life. It was an otherwise ordinary autumn afternoon in our home in Oak Ridge, a small town in Oregon. My husband Nathan was at work, and our children Liam and Sophia were at school. I decided to take advantage of the rare moment of solitude to indulge in a relaxing bath. Our home, a 2-story colonial-style house, has a master suite on the first floor. I carefully locked the bedroom and bathroom doors, feeling secure in my little sanctuary. The sound of the water filling the tub was comforting, almost hypnotic. As I prepared to step into the warm water, our two Labrador retrievers, Max and Luna, suddenly became agitated. Suddenly, I heard the unmistakable sound of the garage door opening. My heart raced, but I forced myself to stay calm. It must be Nathan coming home early, I thought, trying to reassure myself. I waited, expecting to hear the jingling of keys in the bedroom door lock, but the sound never came. Instead, to my astonishment, I heard the bedroom door slowly open. Confusion turned to fear as I realized something was wrong. Nathan always called out to let me know when he arrived early. That's when I noticed Max and Luna's low, menacing growls. Their fur was standing on end, their eyes fixed on the gap under the bathroom door. I froze, my naked body trembling not only from the cold but from the terror that was starting to take hold of me. I slowly crouched down, my eyes fixed on the gap under the door. That's when I saw a pair of unfamiliar feet. Feet that definitely did not belong to my husband. Panic gripped me as I realized my phone was in the bedroom. I stood paralyzed, huddled in the corner of the bathroom, clutchingly holding a can of Lysol like it was a shield. The minutes dragged on like hours, each second marked by the frantic beating of my heart. Max and Luna continued their low growls, their eyes never leaving the gap under the door. The movement on the other side was minimal but perceptible. Whoever or whatever was there knew I was here. The tension was palpable, as if the air had become thick and hard to breathe. My mind raced, searching for an escape. The bathroom window was too small for me to fit through. Screaming for help might provoke the intruder. Every option seemed worse than the last. So, I did the only thing I could. I waited, silently praying for anyone to arrive soon. Time crawled by with agonizing slowness. The shadows in the bathroom began to lengthen as the sun set. The chill of the night crept in, causing my naked skin to break out in goosebumps. But I dared not move to grab a towel. Any sound might trigger something terrible. After what felt like an eternity, the dogs began to calm down. Their growls ceased, replaced by an unsettling silence. I strained my ears, trying to catch any sound from the bedroom. Nothing. The silence was as oppressive as the fear consuming me. Could it be that the intruder had left? Or was he simply waiting for me to let my guard down? I remained motionless for another hour, my aching muscles protesting against the uncomfortable position. The silence was deafening, interrupted only by the occasional tinkling of water in the bathtub. Finally, I heard the sound I had been longing for, the garage door opening again. "Evelyn?" Nathan's voice echoed through the house, bringing a wave of relief so intense that I almost collapsed. "I'm in the bathroom," I shouted, my voice shaking. I heard his hurried footsteps, and within seconds, he was knocking on the door. "Are you okay?" "Why is it locked?" With trembling hands, I unlocked the door. Nathan rushed in, his face a mix of concern and confusion at the sight of me huddled in the corner, naked and shaking, holding a can of Lysol. Max and Luna ran to him, wagging their tails as if nothing had happened. Between sobs, I told Nathan about the intruder. His face paled as I spoke. He immediately reached for his phone to call the police, but I stopped him. "First, check the house," I pleaded. He hesitated, clearly reluctant to leave me alone, but he nodded. Nathan meticulously checked every room, every closet, every hidden corner of our home. He returned looking perplexed. "There's no one here, Evelyn. All the doors and windows are locked from the inside." His voice was gentle, but I could detect a hint of doubt. I sat on the bed, wrapped in a robe, trying to process everything. How could this be? I was certain of what I had seen and heard. The dogs had reacted. Could I have imagined it all? Nathan hugged me, murmuring words of comfort, but I could feel his own confusion and worry. That night, lying next to Nathan, sleep eluded me. Every sound in the house made me jump. The experience had shaken me to my core, leaving me with more questions than answers. How could someone have entered and left without a trace? In the following days, Nathan installed security cameras and changed all the locks. Liam and Sophia, our children, noticed the change in my behavior, but I tried to hide my anxiety from them. I didn't want to scare them with stories of invisible intruders. Weeks passed, and gradually life returned to normal, but the incident stayed with me. a persistent echo in the back of my mind. Sometimes I would find myself staring at the bathroom door, half expecting to see those unfamiliar feet again. One day, while browsing the internet, I stumbled upon a forum dedicated to real scary stories. Hesitantly, I shared my experience, omitting details that could identify me. To my surprise, I received several responses from people who had gone through similar situations. Their stories, though different in the details, shared a common theme: the sense of an inexplicable presence, glimpsed only for a moment, leaving behind only doubt and fear. Today, years later, I still have no explanation for what happened that afternoon. Sometimes, I wonder if it was a stress-induced hallucination, or if there really was an intruder who managed to escape without a trace. The incident has become one of the scariest stories I've ever read on the internet, not just because of its content, but because I lived it. Whatever the truth may be, that experience taught me that there are mysteries in the world that defy simple explanations. And while most people read horror stories online for thrills, some of us carry our own terrifying tales, waiting for the day we understand the unexplainable. My name is Simon, and I never imagined that a simple video call could trigger the most terrifying events of my life. It was 2010, and the internet was still an exciting novelty to me. On that fateful night, I was chatting with my friend Zephyr on Skype, exchanging trivialities and laughing at lame jokes. Suddenly, Zephyr's image froze for an instant, but the video kept running. When it resumed, I noticed a change in his expression. His eyes went wide and he asked with a trembling voice, "Who's the person behind you?" I rolled my eyes, thinking it was one of his stupid pranks. "Very funny, Zephyr. There's no one here," I replied, annoyed, but Zephyr insisted, his voice becoming more urgent with each word. "I'm serious, Simon. There's a kid behind you, about 10 or 12 years old, wearing a red shirt. He's staring straight at the camera." A chill ran down my spine. The seriousness in Zephyr's voice started to affect me. Slowly, I turned my chair, half expecting to see something, half praying to see nothing. The room was empty, just as I knew it would be. But why did Zephyr look so scared? "There's no one here, man," I said, turning back to the screen. Zephyr looked pale, his eyes still fixed on a point behind me. He's gone," he murmured. We ended the call soon after, both of us too shaken to continue. That night marked the beginning of a series of inexplicable events that would turn my home into a horror scene. Days passed after that disturbing video call, but the sense of unease lingered. My bedroom, once a refuge, now felt hostile. The computer desk in particular had become a focal point of disquiet. One night, as I browsed through forums of scary stories, I felt something brush against my foot under the desk. I froze, my heart racing. "It must be a rat," I thought, trying to calm myself down, but the sensation continued, like icy fingers exploring my skin. I jerked away, almost knocking over the chair. I looked under the desk, expecting to see tangled wires or some small intruder. Nothing, just the dark emptiness staring back at me. The following nights brought more disturbances. Objects seemed to move when I wasn't looking. My mother, Lyra, started commenting on things moving by themselves in the kitchen. I wanted to dismiss it all, attributing it to stress or an overactive imagination, until I saw it with my own eyes. A glass in the sink, upside down, started to tinkle as if something was trapped inside. I stood paralyzed, watching it move without anyone touching it. The scary stories I loved to read online seemed to come alive in my own home. The climax came when I started having night visions. Around 2 a.m., I would wake up to see female silhouettes in white standing around my bed. They never spoke, never moved, just watched. I tried to convince myself it was sleep paralysis, but the terror I felt was too real to ignore. My Aunt Raven, who visited us frequently, also reported strange experiences. "Something touched my foot under the computer desk," she said one day, her face pale with fear. It was the confirmation I dreaded. He wasn't alone in these chilling experiences. The tension in the house grew by the day. We slept poorly, startled by every noise. The shadows seemed darker, the corners more menacing. Our home, once a cozy haven, had transformed into a constant horror scene. That's when my grandmother Willow decided to intervene. With a determination that only comes with age, she declared it was time for a thorough cleansing, not just physical, but spiritual. "There are negative energies here," she said, her eyes shining with ancient wisdom, "and we're going to drive them out." The morning arrived with an air of anticipation. Grandmother Willow, her gray hair pulled back in a tight bun, arrived early, carrying a mysterious bag. Her eyes, usually gentle, held a gleam of determination I rarely saw. "Simon," she said, her voice firm, "today we're going to cleanse this house of all negative energies. I'll need your help." I nodded, feeling a mix of fear and relief. Finally, someone was taking action against the inexplicable events that plagued us. We started in the kitchen, the place where my mother Lyra had first noticed strange occurrences. Willow lit a handful of herbs, filling the air with aromatic smoke. "Sage," she explained. "It purifies the environment." We moved methodically through the house, Willow murmuring words I didn't understand, while I opened windows and doors, let the bad energies out. She instructed. The air felt lighter with each room we cleansed. When we reached my bedroom, a shiver ran down my spine. There, near the computer desk, where it had all started, the atmosphere felt denser, almost palpable. Willow paused, her eyes narrowing. "It's here," she murmured. "This is where it's concentrated." She took out a small vial from her bag and sprinkled a clear liquid into the corners of the room. The scent of lavender filled the air, overriding the musty smell I hadn't even noticed before. As we worked, Willow began to speak. "You know, Simon, sometimes the digital world opens doors that shouldn't be opened. Online horror stories, haunted tales. They can attract energies we don't fully understand." Her words made me reflect on all the scary stories I had read online, on the paranormal forums I frequented. Had I somehow invited these forces into our home by indulging in these tales? The cleansing continued for hours. By the end, we were exhausted, but there was a palpable sense of change in the air. The house felt brighter, lighter. The shadows in the corners didn't seem as menacing. That night, for the first time in weeks, I slept without interruptions. No visions of women in white, no unexplained sounds. When I woke up the next morning, I felt as if a weight had been lifted from my shoulders. In the following days, normalcy gradually returned to our home. Objects stayed where we left them, and the night silence was just silence. Zephyr called me a few days later, asking if everything was all right. I told him about Willow's cleansing, and he seemed relieved. "You know," he said, hesitant, "I really did see something that night. I wasn't joking." "I know," I replied, feeling a last shiver. "But it's over now." As I hung up, I looked at the computer screen. The windows of horror story forums were all closed. I decided that, for a while, I'd keep the world of the unexplained where it belonged in the digital fiction. Weeks passed since Willow's cleansing, and life resumed its normal course. However, the experiences I had went deep, leaving imprints on my psyche. Sitting in front of the computer, now free from unsettling presences, I reflected on everything that had happened. The scary stories I used to devour online now felt different. They weren't just harmless entertainment anymore. They were potential gateways to a world I didn't fully understand. Every account of eerie experiences, every real-life horror tale, resonated in a new and disturbing way. One night, while browsing idly, I stumbled upon a forum dedicated to discussing the dangers of online horror stories. Users shared their own inexplicable experiences, many of them eerily echoing mine. One comment in particular caught my attention. Sometimes when we delve deeply into these scary narratives, we open doors in our minds, and we don't always know what might walk through them. Those words made me think of what Willow had said about the digital world opening doors that shouldn't be opened. Had my obsession with haunted tales actually invited something into our home? The idea was both fascinating and terrifying. I decided to share my own story on the forum, omitting details that could identify me. The response was overwhelming. Dozens of people reported similar experience and explained visions, feelings of presence, objects moving on their own. They all seemed to have one thing in common: a deep immersion in the world of online horror stories. A user who identified as a psychologist offered an interesting perspective. Fear is a powerful emotion. When we constantly expose ourselves to scary narratives, our brain can start interpreting reality in distorted ways. This doesn't make the experiences any less real to the person living them, but it offers a possible explanation. His words brought some comfort, but they also made me question how many of the popular scary stories circulating online were a result of this phenomenon. How many ghostly encounters were born from fear-saturated minds? I looked at the computer screen, reflecting on the power of the stories we share online. They have the ability to connect us, to make us feel less alone in our strangest experiences, but they can also shape our perception of reality in ways we don't fully comprehend. I decided that from then on I would approach horror stories with a new respect and caution. I wouldn't stop enjoying them, but I'd maintain a healthy distance, always remembering that the line between fiction and reality can be thinner than we imagine. I turned off the computer and looked out the window. The night was calm. The shadows were just shadows. I smiled, grateful for the peace that had returned to our home. The scary adventures I once craved would now remain confined to the digital pages where they belonged. And me, I would sleep soundly knowing that some doors are better left closed. But deep down, in a dark corner of my mind, the doubt remains, and sometimes, on the quietest nights, when the shadows seem to move on their own, I find myself looking at the edges of my bed, half expecting, half dreading to see those bloody hands once more. My name is Skylar, and I am 28 years old now, but the memory of that night still haunts me as if it were yesterday. I was only 8 years old when it happened, an age when the fear of the dark was still a constant companion. This experience has become one of the scariest stories I've ever read on the internet, a horror tale that continues to haunt me. Perhaps some mysteries are better left unexplained, some doors better left closed. We lived in an old house in the suburbs of Boston, me, my mother Elaine, and my grandmother Margaret. Dad had left us a long time ago, and Mom worked the night shift at a local hospital to support us. But one thing is certain, that night changed my perception of the world forever, reminding me that sometimes true horrors don't come from monsters or ghosts, but from the unfathomable depths of reality itself. On that particular night, the air was heavy with an unusual stillness. The wind blew softly against the shutters, creating a nearly hypnotic rhythm. I lay in a double bed I shared with my mother, the sheets pulled up to my chin, trying to ignore the shadows dancing on the walls of the dimly lit room. That's when I felt it, a presence, something that shouldn't have been there. My heart started pounding, and I could feel cold sweat trickling down my forehead. I kept my eyes tightly shut, as if that could make the feeling go away, but it persisted, growing stronger by the second. With a shudder that ran through my entire body, I slowly opened my eyes. What I saw next chilled me to the bone. Hands. Not normal hands, but grotesque appendages made of clotted blood, exposed bones, and skin hanging in strips. They were gripping the edge of the mattress, the twisted fingers writhing as they tried to climb onto the bed, paralyzed by terror. I couldn't scream, couldn't move. All I could do was watch as those horrible hands drew closer. Then I felt movement beside me, and gathering all my courage, I turned my head. As I turned, my eyes beheld something that defied logic. Lying next to me was a figure I can only describe as a white shadow. It wasn't solid, nor was it transparent, but an unsettling blend of both. Its outline was vaguely humanoid, but distorted in a way that made my stomach churn. The figure had no discernible face, just a smooth, pale surface where eyes, nose, and mouth should have been. Still, I could feel its piercing gaze upon me, as if it were probing my soul. The air around us turned icy, and I could see my own breath forming shaky clouds. I tried to scream, but my voice caught in my throat. Fear paralyzed me completely, making it impossible to move a single muscle. The bloody hands continued their slow and relentless climb up the side of the bed, now almost reaching the top of the mattress. I squeezed my eyes shut, praying for it all to be just a terrible nightmare. I counted to 10 in my mind, a technique my grandmother Margaret had taught me to cope with fear. 1. Well, with each number, I hoped that when I opened my eyes, everything would be gone. But when I reached 10 and looked again, The horrifying scene remained unchanged. The white figure beside me began to move, slowly leaning towards me. I felt its cold breath on my face, carrying a putrid odor that made me gag. The bloody hands were now fully on the bed, their bony fingers crawling in my direction. At that moment, something inside me awakened. It was as if my survival instinct had finally overcome the paralyzing terror that held me captive. With a muffled scream, I threw myself out of bed, my feet barely touching the cold wooden floor. I ran towards the door, my heart pounding so hard I feared it might burst at any moment. Behind me, I heard a wet, sticky sound as if something viscous was dragging itself across the floor. I dared not look back, fearing that the sight would turn me to stone again. The hallway seemed to stretch endlessly before me, the shadows dancing on the walls as if they were alive. I stumbled several times, my legs shaking uncontrollably. Every second felt like an eternity as I struggled to reach my grandmother Margaret's room. Finally, I reached her door. My sweaty hand slipped on the doorknob as I desperately tried to open it. "Grandma," I shouted with all the strength I could muster. "Grandma, please let me in." I heard movement inside the room, and after what felt like an eternity, the door opened. Margaret stood there, her eyes wide with concern. "Skylar, what's wrong?" she asked, her voice trembling. I threw myself into her arms, sobbing uncontrollably. Between gasps, I tried to explain to my grandmother what had happened. The words tumbled out, mixed with tears and tremors. Margaret held me tight, stroking my hair as I unburdened the terror I had experienced. "It's all right now, dear," she murmured, but I could sense the tension in her voice. Her eyes darted across the dark corridor, as if she feared something might emerge from the shadows at any moment. "Let's stay here, okay? We don't need to go back there." We spent the rest of the night in Margaret's room, me curled up in her arms, unable to close my eyes. Every time I tried, the horrible images returned to haunt me. The bloody hands, the faceless white figure. My grandmother stayed awake with me, telling gentle stories to calm me down, but the fear persisted. When the first rays of sunlight finally crept through the curtain cracks, light always had the power to dispel the night terrors, but this time the sense of safety was fragile, as if it could shatter at any moment. Margaret suggested we check my room together. With hesitant steps, we approached the door. My heart raced again as she turned the doorknob. To our relief and confusion, everything was exactly as it should be. No sign of the horrible hands or the white figure. The sheets were rumpled from where I had jumped out of bed. But apart from that, nothing indicated the terrifying experience I had gone through. "You see, dear, there's nothing here," Margaret said, but her voice betrayed an uncertainty I had never heard before. She examined every corner of the room, looking for anything out of place, but found nothing. That morning, when my mother Elaine returned from work, she found us in the kitchen, pale and exhausted. We told her what had happened, or at least what I believed had happened. Elaine listened attentively, her face a mix of concern and skepticism. "It must have been a very vivid nightmare, Skylar," she said finally, hugging me. "Sometimes our minds can play tricks on us, especially when we're alone in the dark." I wanted to believe her. I wanted to believe that it was all just a terrible dream, but something inside me knew that what I had experienced was too real to be merely a product of my imagination. The sensations, the vivid details, the absolute terror, they all remained etched in my memory with chilling clarity. In the days that followed, my mother made arrangements for me to never be alone in that night again. Margaret started sleeping in my room when Elaine had night shifts, but even with these precautions, the fear lingered. Every shadow, every strange noise made me jump. Years passed, and I grew up trying to rationalize that night. I sought scientific and psychological explanations, anything that could make sense of what happened. But deep down, in a dark corner of my mind, the doubt remains. And sometimes, on the quietest nights, when the shadows seem to move on their own, I find myself looking at the edges of my bed, half expecting, half dreading to see those bloody hands once more. This experience has become one of the scariest stories I've ever read on the internet. A horror tale that continues to haunt me. Perhaps some mysteries are better left unexplained, Some doors better left closed, but one thing is certain. That night changed my perception of the world forever, reminding me that sometimes true horrors don't come from monsters or ghosts, but from the unfathomable depths of reality itself. My name is Haley, and I never imagined that an ordinary night would turn into one of the scariest stories of my life. One that would become a tale for the internet. It all started on a typical Friday, after a long day at work. I arrived home exhausted, barely able to keep my eyes open as I prepared for bed. The apartment was quiet as usual. My boyfriend Jace was away on business trips, so I had the place to myself. Usually I enjoyed these moments of solitude, but that night something felt different. There was a strange atmosphere in the air, as if someone was watching me. I ignored the feeling, attributing it to my tiredness. After a quick shower, I slipped into my favorite pajamas and fell into bed. The soft mattress enveloped me, and soon I found myself sinking into a deep sleep. I don't know how much time had passed when I felt something soft touching my hair. At first it was gentle, almost comforting. Half asleep, I smiled, thinking that Jace had returned early and was caressing my hair. He often did that, and I loved it. But then, the touch changed. What was once gentle became aggressive. I felt my head being pushed down into the pillow with increasing force. My heart raced, and a chill ran down my spine. Something was wrong. Very wrong. My eyes snapped open, panic taking over me. The darkness of the room seemed denser than usual, as if it were alive. With my heart hammering in my chest, I turned abruptly. That's when I saw him. A male figure was sneaking towards my closet. The faint light coming through the window revealed one detail that will forever be etched in my memory. A smile. It wasn't a common smile, but something distorted, almost inhuman. It was a smile that exuded malevolence. I froze for a moment, my brain struggling to process what was happening. This couldn't be real. It had to be a nightmare, one of those scary stories we read online. But the pain in my scalp, where the intruder's fingers had gripped my hair moments ago, was very real. In a surge of adrenaline, I jumped out of bed. My feet barely touched the ground as I ran out of the room, rushing down the stairs. I didn't look back, fearing to see that smile chasing me. Reaching the kitchen, I grabbed the first thing I saw, a kitchen knife. The cold metal in my hand gave me a false sense of security, with my heart still racing and my breath coming in gasps. I forced myself to return to the bedroom. I needed to face this, needed to be sure. Climbing the stairs, each step echoed in my ears like thunder. The knife trembled in my sweaty hand as I approached the bedroom. The hallway seemed endless, stretching out like in a nightmare. Finally, I reached the bedroom door. I hesitated for a moment, remembering that terrifying smile. I took a deep breath, gathering all the courage I could muster, and pushed the door open. The room was exactly as I had left it. The messy bed, the curtains swaying gently in the night breeze. There was no sign of the intruder. I searched every corner, looked under the bed, behind the curtains. Nothing. It was when I approached the closet that I noticed it. A smell. It wasn't the familiar scent of my clothes or cleaning products. It was nauseating, a mixture of rancid sweat and something I couldn't identify. The kind of odor you would associate with online horror stories. The ones that make your stomach churn. With my hand shaking, I grasped the closet doorknob. The metal was cold against my skin. I counted to 3 in my mind and swung the door open, knife at the ready. The closet was empty. Hanging clothes, lined up shoes, everything in its place. But the smell, it was stronger than ever. It was as if it had permeated every fiber of fabric, every inch of space. I recoiled, confused and terrified. My mind spun, trying to find a logical explanation for what had happened. Had it been just a vivid dream, a hallucination brought on by stress? But the smell was too real. The sensation of the aggressive fingers and my hair still throbbing in my scalp. With trembling legs, I sat on the edge of the bed. the knife still clutched in my hand. The clock on the bedside table read 3:27 a.m. The silence of the night seemed to mock me, as if it held a secret I couldn't decipher. I picked up my phone and, with shaking fingers, started typing a message to Jace. I stopped. What could I say? That a stranger with a scary smile had broken into our bedroom and then vanished without a trace, leaving only an inexplicable smell? It sounded like one of those scary internet stories that no one believes are real. In that moment, I made a decision. I wouldn't stay there waiting for the intruder to return. With my heart still pounding, I packed a quick bag, grabbed the car keys, and left the apartment. As I drove through the sleeping city towards my sister's house, I couldn't stop glancing at the rearview mirror, fearing to see that macabre smile following me. That night would become one of the creepiest experiences I would ever have. A constant reminder that sometimes the scariest nightmares happen when we're wide awake. The cold night air seeped through the slightly open window of my car as I drove home after another exhausting shift at the pizzeria. The digital clock on the dashboard read 11:47 p.m. and the deserted streets seemed even gloomier under the dim light of the sparsely placed street lamps. My name is Jared, and I never imagined that this ordinary work night would turn into the most terrifying experience of my life. The familiar road wound its way past the orchard on the left, enclosed by a rusty wire fence, and the solitary house on the right, its dark windows seeming to watch me. The silence was broken only by the low hum of the engine and the occasional crackle of tires on small stones in the asphalt. As I climbed the hill, a chill ran down my spine, as if something was about to happen, and then I saw it. Something emerged from the shadows of the orchard, moving with an unnatural agility. My heart raced as the creature took 2 strides towards the yellow center line of the road. In the faint light of my headlights, I could make out its grotesque form. It was tall, maybe around 8 feet, with a grayish skin that seemed stretched over a skeletal body. Its protruding ribs contrasted with its extreme thinness, giving it a cadaverous appearance, but it was its eyes that paralyzed me with terror. Large, oblique, and as black as the darkest night, they seemed to absorb all the light around them. Pointed ears and clawed hands completed the image of a nightmare come to life. In the blink of an eye, the creature vanished, leaving me panting and trembling at the wheel. I slammed on the brakes so hard that the car skidded to a stop in the middle of the road. My whole body was shaking, and I could feel cold sweat trickling down my back. I frantically scanned the surroundings, searching for any sign of that terrible apparition, but found only the silent darkness of the night. With my heart still pounding, I shifted into gear and sped towards home, glancing nervously over my shoulder every few seconds. My fingers gripped the steering wheel so tightly that my knuckles turned white. The asphalt blurred as I drove faster, ignoring all speed limits. Every shadow along the roadside seemed to move, and every engine noise sounded like a distant scream. My mind spun, trying to process what I had just seen. Could it be possible that this creature was real? Or was I simply exhausted after a long shift, my imagination playing cruel tricks? Upon reaching home, I practically jumped out of the car, locking it with trembling hands. The street was deserted, but I felt as if 1,000 eyes were watching me from the shadows. I ran to the front door, struggling with the keys for a few agonizing seconds before finally managing to open it. Once inside, I locked the door and leaned against it, panting. My roommate Evelyn was sitting on the couch, watching a horror movie on TV. She looked at me, surprised by my abrupt entrance. "Jared, are you okay? You look like you've seen a ghost," she commented, pausing the movie. I wanted to laugh at the irony of her choice of words, but the sound caught in my throat. "Ev," I started, my voice faltering. "You won't believe what just happened." The words poured out of me like a torrent. I told her about the creature on the road, describing every horrifying detail I had witnessed. As I spoke, I realized how absurd the story sounded. It was as if I were narrating one of those scary stories people share online. Except this was real. I had lived it. Evelyn listened silently, her face a mix of concern and skepticism. When I finished, she stood up and placed a comforting hand on my shoulder. "Jared, you've been working late every night this week. Maybe the exhaustion is affecting your perception. Why don't you take a hot shower and try to get some rest?" I wanted to protest, to insist that what I saw was real, but the look in her eyes made me hesitate. She truly believed I was imagining things. Reluctantly, I followed Evelyn's advice and headed for a shower. The hot water eased some of the tension in my muscles, but it couldn't wash away the terrifying images that persisted in my mind. When I stepped out of the bathroom, I noticed Evelyn hunched over her laptop, her brow furrowed in concentration. "Hey, Jared," she called, her voice tense. "I think you should see this." I approached cautiously, still trembling slightly. On the screen, I saw an online forum dedicated to accounts of paranormal experiences and scary stories from the internet. Evelyn had opened a specific thread, and my heart nearly stopped when I read the title, "Strange Creature Spotted on Oakville Road." With trembling hands, I grabbed the mouse and started scrolling through the page. There were dozens of reports, all describing encounters similar to mine. People talked about a tall, thin creature with grayish skin and black eyes, mostly spotted at night near the orchard-lined road. Some posts dated back months, while others were just a few days old. This is impossible," I murmured, feeling a chill down my spine. "How can there be so many people who've seen the same thing?" Evelyn bit her lip, clearly disturbed. "I don't know, Jared, but it seems you're not alone in this experience." We continued reading, absorbing every detail of the accounts. One particular post caught my attention. A user named Lunamoth47 described an encounter almost identical to mine, which had taken place just 3 nights ago. She mentioned the same stretch of road, the same terrifying creature vanishing in the blink of an eye. "We need to investigate this further," I declared, feeling a mix of fear and determination. Evelyn looked at me with concern. "Are you sure? This seems dangerous, Jared." I nodded, resolute. "I need to know the truth, Ev. I can't just ignore what happened." We spent the next few hours immersed in research, seeking any information that could explain the sightings. We uncovered local legends about strange creatures in the orchard, accounts of mysterious disappearances over the years, and theories ranging from secret government experiments to visitors from other worlds. As the sun began to rise, painting the sky with hues of pink and orange, Evelyn and I exchanged weary glances, yet resolute. "What do we do now?" she asked softly. I looked out the window, towards the road where it all began. "Now," I replied, "we uncover the truth." The following day passed in an anxious blur of preparation. Evelyn and I decided to return to the road that night, equipped with a video camera and powerful flashlights. As the sun set, my stomach clenched with a mix of fear and anticipation. We arrived at the location around 10:30 p.m., parking on the shoulder near the orchard. The night silence was oppressive, broken only by the occasional rustling of leaves in the breeze. Evelyn turned on the camera while I swept the area with the flashlight, my heart hammering in my chest. "Jared, look," Evelyn whispered suddenly, pointing towards something near the orchard fence. I turned the flashlight in that direction and froze. There, partially hidden behind a tree, stood a tall, thin figure. For a moment, I thought it was the creature. But then I noticed something odd. We cautiously approached, Evelyn filming as we went. When we got close enough, I let out an exclamation of surprise. It wasn't a supernatural creature, but rather an elaborate setup made of branches, fabric, and what appeared to be a latex mask. Is this a hoax?" I murmured, incredulous. Evelyn filmed every detail of the structure. As we examined it, we heard a noise coming from the nearby bushes. We turned towards the sound, our flashlights illuminating a middle-aged man trying to sneak away. "Hey, you! Stop right there!" I shouted. The man froze, then slowly turned to face us, his hands raised in surrender. "Please don't hurt me," he pleaded, his voice shaking. In the following minutes, the man, who identified himself as Walter, confessed everything. He was the owner of the orchard, and he had created the fake creature as part of an elaborate plan to attract tourists and save his struggling business. Using illusionist tricks and the cover of night, he made the creature appear and disappear quickly, scaring passing drivers. I just wanted to save my property," Walter sobbed, sounding genuinely remorseful. "I never meant to hurt anyone. I thought that if I created a local legend, people would come to visit the orchard." Evelyn and I stared at each other, still processing this revelation. On one hand, I felt relief that there was no supernatural creature. On the other hand, a part of me was disappointed by the mundane explanation. We decided not to call the police, but we made Walter promise to end his scheme immediately. As we drove back home, Evelyn and I discussed what had transpired. "You know," she said thoughtfully, "this shows that those scary stories we read online aren't always what they seem." I nodded, reflecting on the experience. "That's true. But it also shows how fear can make us see things that aren't really there." I glanced out the window at the now familiar road, much less frightening. I guess I learned an important lesson about not letting fear and imagination get the better of me. We arrived home exhausted but with a sense of closure. As I prepared for bed, I thought about all the people who had shared their experiences online. I wondered how many other mysterious creatures out there had equally mundane explanations. That night, I slept soundly for the first time in days, free from the fear that had haunted me. The lonely road held its secrets, but now I knew that not all mysteries are supernatural. Sometimes, reality can be as fascinating as any horror story. When I was 8 years old, our family lived in the middle of nowhere. Literally, the nearest town was a 30-minute drive away. Our house was an old building surrounded by dense forest. Living there had its advantages, such as the tranquility and direct contact with nature. But there was also a sense of isolation that was sometimes disturbing. The scariest stories I read on the internet didn't come close to the feeling of loneliness that this place evoked. My name is Caleb, and one night I was sitting on the porch, gazing at the starry sky. My father had gone out to get firewood, and my mother was inside tending to my younger brother, James. It was a quiet night until our guard dog, Max, started barking frenetically. The sound was so intense and desperate that it made me jump out of my chair. I ran to see what was happening and found Max with his tail between his legs, barking aggressively into the darkness. At first, I thought it might be a fox or some other wild animal. But there was something strange about Max's behavior. He was a large and brave German shepherd, but that night he seemed truly scared. I followed his gaze and saw, at the edge of the road, a figure that left me paralyzed. At first glance it looked like a dog, but there was something deeply wrong with it. The dog had no hair, and it moved in a strange way, as if it were a human trying to walk on all fours. Its posture was bizarre, with the rear end higher than its head. And its eyes were human. They stared at me with an intensity I had never seen before. Fear gripped me, and for a few seconds, I was unable to move or shout. That creature just stood there, staring at me, and I could feel its penetrating gaze. Suddenly, it started running at an incredible speed. It was too fast to be human, especially moving in that manner. Max continued barking but didn't dare to chase the creature. I wanted to run inside and tell my mother what I had seen, but my feet felt rooted to the ground. That sight seemed like something straight out of the scary stories people shared online. But this was real, right in front of me. When I finally managed to move, I ran inside and locked the door. I told my mother what I had seen, but she tried to calm me down, saying it was probably just my imagination. But I knew what I had seen. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw those human eyes staring at me. It was the beginning of a series of events that would turn my childhood into a nightmare. The rest of that night was a blur of anxiety and fear. I lay in my bed listening to every sound the house made. The scariest stories I had read online seemed harmless compared to the terror I felt at that moment. James, in the crib next to me, slept peacefully, unaware of what I had witnessed. I wondered if I should tell him or spare him the fear. In the early hours of the morning, I woke up to a strange sound. It was a scratching noise at the window. My heart started racing. I slowly got up, trying not to make a sound, and went to the window. As I pulled the curtain, I saw claw marks on the glass. There was no sign of the creature, but the marks were fresh. I ran to wake up my parents, but my father was out, and my mother, tired, just mumbled that it was probably a branch scratching the window. The next morning, I told my father about the marks on the window. He took me seriously because he trusted my observation skills. We decided to investigate together. The day was clear, and the sunlight seemed to dispel some of the fear. When we reached the window, he saw the marks and furrowed his brow. "This isn't the work of a branch, Caleb. Something was here last night," he said, concern evident in his voice. We decided to walk around the property to look for more signs. We found strange footprints in the soil, resembling an animal's but with a shape we couldn't identify. The footprints led into the forest. My father hesitated, but we decided to follow them. Max was by our side, his fur bristling and his gaze alert. He didn't bark but sniffed the ground and growled softly. As we followed the footprints, the weather changed. The once clear sky turned cloudy, and the cold wind cut through our skin. The forest seemed denser, as if it were closing in on us. We reached a clearing where the footprints disappeared. There was a sense of emptiness there, as if something had been ripped away. My father looked around, clearly worried. "Let's go back, Caleb. It's not safe to continue," he said, and I readily agreed. Upon returning, the tension in the house was palpable. My online horror stories now seemed like child's play. I didn't tell James about the creature, but he could sense that something was wrong. Max wouldn't leave our side, as if he wanted to protect the family. That night, we locked ourselves in early, hoping the nightmare wouldn't repeat itself. Little did we know that this was just the beginning of our scary adventure. The following day dawned with a heavy aura, and everyone in the house seemed to feel it. I tried to forget what I had seen, but the memory of that creature's eyes haunted me. The ghost stories and scary tales I read online seemed to come alive in my mind. My father decided that we should keep a vigilant eye and avoid going out at night until we understood what was going on. However, that night something compelled us to leave the house again. Max started barking, but this time it wasn't a warning bark, it was a bark of desperation. We ran to the door, and when we opened it, we saw Max running towards the forest, barking furiously. My father, armed with a flashlight and an old shotgun, decided to follow him. Insisting on joining him, I was allowed to accompany him while my mother and James stayed inside. We entered the forest, following Max's barks. The air was thick, and each step seemed to amplify the sound in the darkness. My father's flashlight barely illuminated the path ahead. Suddenly, the bark ceased. Everything went eerily silent. My father and I stopped, breathless, trying to listen for any sound that would indicate Max's location. Then we heard a low growl followed by a sound resembling a human moan. We ran towards the sound, and when we reached a small clearing, we saw something that made our blood run cold. Max was standing there, growling, his fur bristling, staring at the creature from the previous night. It was there in the middle of the clearing, watching us with those penetrating human eyes. Its skinny, hairless body reflected the flashlight's beam, making the scene even more surreal and terrifying. My father raised the shotgun but hesitated. The creature didn't seem afraid of us. "Stay behind me, Caleb," my father whispered, his eyes fixed on the creature. I obeyed, trying to stay calm. Max inched forward, still growling but not attacking. The creature watched us, as if studying our every move. Then, suddenly, it let out a guttural sound and ran towards us. My father fired the shotgun, the sound echoing through the night, but the creature dodged with impossible agility. Everything happened so fast that I could barely keep up. The creature jumped over us, but Max lunged at it, intercepting it. They rolled on the ground, fighting fiercely. I screamed for my father, who tried to reload the shotgun. The fight between Max and the creature seemed to last an eternity. But then, with one final growl, Max managed to push it away, sending it fleeing back into the forest. We were breathless, and my heart was racing. Max returned to our side, injured but alive. My father lowered the shotgun and pulled me into a tight embrace. "Let's get out of here," he said, his voice trembling. We hurried back home, relieved to be away from that nightmare. We knew that creature was still out there, but for now, we were safe. We returned home with Max, who was hurt but seemed to be recovering. The tension in the house was palpable, and none of us could forget what had happened. The best scary stories we had ever heard paled in comparison to the real terror we were experiencing. The fear of the unknown haunted us, and every sound seemed to announce the creature's return. That night we all stayed in the living room, together, trying to find some safety in each other's company. My father reinforced the doors and windows, and Max lay near the fireplace, still on alert. My mother, who had always been skeptical about online horror stories and paranormal events, was visibly shaken. She kept James close to her, as if proximity could protect him from any harm. A few hours passed, and the silence was broken only by the crackling of the firewood in the fireplace. Then, without warning, my father's flashlight flickered and went out. We were plunged into darkness, with only the fire's light to guide us. My heart raced, and I could feel the fear of those around me. My father tried to calm us down, but the nervousness was evident in his voice. Suddenly, we heard a sound from outside. It was a scratching noise, much louder and closer than before. Max immediately stood up, growling. My father grabbed the shotgun and walked to the door, gesturing for us to remain silent. He slowly opened the door, shotgun ready, and we followed him, trying to make as little noise as possible. Max was the first one out, cautiously sniffing the air. When we reached the backyard, we saw the creature again, standing at the edge of the forest, as if it had been waiting for us. My father raised the shotgun, but this time, before he could pull the trigger, the creature did something unexpected. It stood up on its hind legs, like a human. Its eyes held a pleading expression as it stared at us. My father lowered the shotgun, confused. The creature took a step forward, but Max growled, making it stop. We stood there, at an impasse, trying to understand what was happening. Then, the creature raised one of its front paws, revealing a deep wound. In that moment, we realized that this was not just a wild animal, but something or someone who was suffering. Not knowing what else to do, my father decided not to shoot. We slowly backed away into the house, keeping our eyes on the creature. It watched us until we entered and closed the door. That encounter had changed something within us. It wasn't just the fear of the unknown, but a new understanding that sometimes the scary stories we hear or read can have a depth we don't comprehend at first glance. The next morning, the creature was gone, leaving only the footprints and the memory of an inexplicable encounter. Life went on, but that night remained etched in our memories as one of the most intense, scary tales we had ever lived through. We learned to cope with fear and uncertainty, but above all, we learned that true terror often lies in what we cannot fully understand. That experience marked us forever, and whenever we hear online horror stories or ghost tales, we remember that night and the mystery surrounding it. And although we never discovered what that creature truly was, its memory persists as a symbol of the inexplicable mysteries that life can present. "Surprise!" exclaimed my best friend Aurora with a radiant smile. "To celebrate my wedding tomorrow, the family arranged a slumber party for us bridesmaids at an Airbnb. Isn't it awesome?" Coraline smiled back, but my enthusiasm was tempered. The idea of spending the night before the wedding at an unknown Airbnb made me a little nervous. However, Aurora's excitement was contagious, and I didn't want to dampen the fun. "Of course, it sounds amazing," I agreed, joining the other bridesmaids in their enthusiastic applause. "Where is this mysterious place?" One of the other bridesmaids, Luna, explained. It's a lovely apartment downtown. A family friend of Aurora's, Mr. Johnson, is the host. He kindly offered the place to us as a wedding gift. The apartment we found was spacious and elegantly decorated. Located in a vibrant, lively neighborhood, it seemed like the perfect setting for our night of fun and wedding preparation. I can't wait to relax and get ready for the big day tomorrow, Aurora said, her eyes sparkling with excitement. Let's make this an unforgettable night. The evening started well, with laughter and lively conversations as we enjoyed snacks and drinks. During these chats, Aurora shared stories from her childhood, bringing back memories of our past adventures and reinforcing how close our friendship had always been. However, as midnight approached, a subtle shift occurred in the atmosphere. The lights seemed dimmer, casting odd shadows on the walls, and an uncomfortable silence descended upon us. Let's play a game of guessing each other's nightmares, suggested Luna, her smile a bit nervous. It might be fun and help us relax before the wedding. Coraline, hesitated. I'd always been prone to vivid nightmares, and the idea of bringing them up didn't appeal to me. However, I didn't want to spoil the fun. One by one, we shared our deepest fears. When it was my turn, I told them about a recurring dream I had, where a stranger watched through the window as a malevolent presence slowly crept up on me. When I finished, I noticed that all the bridesmaids looked disturbed, especially Aurora. Oh my God, Coraline, she said, her eyes wide. I've had a similar nightmare recently. Someone watching me through the window, but I couldn't see their face. A chill ran down my spine. Really? When did you have this dream? Actually, it was last night, Aurora admitted, her voice trembling. And it wasn't the first time. I've had disturbing dreams about this apartment before, but I brushed them off, thinking it was just wedding stress. The conversation died down, replaced by an uncomfortable silence. Coraline, lay awake in bed, staring into the darkness of the room. The nightmare was still fresh in my memory, leaving me agitated and restless. The feeling of being watched persisted, even while awake. I turned onto my side, facing the window. The moon shone through the curtains, casting patterns of light and shadow on the wall. My heart raced as I thought of someone out there watching me. And then I saw her, a shadowy figure standing on the street, staring directly at the bedroom window. My blood ran cold. I screamed, waking up the other bridesmaids. What is it? Aurora asked, rushing into the room, followed by Luna. Are you okay, Coraline? There. I pointed to the window, my body trembling. There was someone out there looking in. Luna ran to the window, pulling aside the curtains. There's no one there? She said, her voice confused. Did you have another nightmare? I sat up in bed, my heart still pounding. No, I was awake. I saw someone out there. Aurora sat down on the bed next to me, taking my hand. Coraline, maybe you're still drowsy. Let's try to calm down and get back to sleep. The wedding is tomorrow, and we need to be rested. I tried to relax, but the fear persisted. It was 3 a.m. when I finally gave in to sleep, still feeling that something was very, very wrong. The next morning I woke with a start, sensing that something was amiss. The room was quiet, and the other bridesmaids were still asleep. I slowly got up, feeling a sense of urgency. Something wasn't right. And then I remembered the previous night, the nightmare, and the shadowy figure on the street. I rushed to the window, pulling aside the curtains, and my heart stopped. Out on the sidewalk stood the same hooded figure, her eyes fixed on the bedroom window. I screamed, alerting the other bridesmaids. Aurora and Luna woke with a start, their faces reflecting confusion and fear. What's going on? Aurora asked, her eyes still sleepy. The figure, she's there, I said, pointing to the window. The same person I saw last night. Luna rushed to join us, looking out the window. My God, you're right. Who the hell is she? Alarmed, we called the police, explaining the situation. The officers arrived promptly and approached the mysterious figure, who turned out to be a homeless man with mental health issues. He had fixated on the apartment, believing it belonged to him. The situation was scary, but also a relief. The apartment itself wasn't cursed. It was just an unfortunate series of events. The man was taken away to receive help, and we finally managed to relax. The wedding day arrived, and Aurora was radiant in her white dress. Despite the disturbing events of the previous night, we managed to enjoy the ceremony and reception. Aurora and I exchanged meaningful glances during the celebration, knowing that our friendship had grown even stronger after the experience. However, the experience left its mark on me. I, Coraline, always skeptical of Airbnb horror stories, now had my own chilling tale to tell, and although the danger had passed, the memory of the shadowy figure watching me through the window would stay with me for a long time. It was supposed to be just another night in an Airbnb during my European vacation. But from the start, something felt odd about that apartment in Rome. The front door had not one, but 5 different locks. I looked intrigued, thinking that perhaps the host was a bit paranoid about security. However, when I saw the windows, I realized that the bars on them were not merely decorative. They were strong, solid, and clearly meant to keep people out or in. I, Claire, and my partner, Josh, had booked the place for just one night. We were traveling through Europe, and like many travelers, we relied on Airbnb to find affordable accommodations. The listing for the place had seemed promising. Cozy apartment in the heart of Rome, perfect for couples. Authentic experience in a vibrant neighborhood. When we arrived, the neighborhood did feel vibrant, but not necessarily in a good way. The apartment was on the ground floor of an old building, on a narrow, busy street. The noise from the traffic and crowds was constant, but the place seemed spacious and well decorated. "What a find!" Josh exclaimed, throwing his backpack on the floor and flopping onto the comfortable sofa. 5 stars for this place for sure. I wasn't quite convinced. There was something about the atmosphere of the place that made me uneasy. Maybe it was the numerous locks on the door, or the bars on the windows, which seemed to indicate that something or someone needed to be kept out or in. "Do you think this place is safe?" I asked Josh, voicing my concerns. "I mean, why would anyone need so many locks and bars?" Josh laughed and shook his head. "To keep people like us out, probably. Relax, love. We're in Rome. Let's enjoy our stay and explore the city. We might even get to meet some of the neighbors later." Josh always had a way of seeing the positive side of things, which was one of his qualities that I admired the most. I, on the other hand, had always been more cautious, tending to analyze the details for potential problems. It was a balance that usually worked well for us. But on that night, the tension in the air seemed to exaggerate our differences. It didn't take long for me to find out why the locks and bars were necessary. We were having dinner, a homemade meal we had prepared in the small but well-equipped kitchen, when we heard a noise at the front door. It sounded like someone was trying to open the locks, one by one. Josh and I looked at each other, surprised. "Were you expecting guests?" I asked, a little worried. "Of course not," Josh replied, getting up to check. "It must be the wind or something." But as he approached the door, the noises stopped. Josh unlocked the locks and opened the door a crack. To our astonishment, there was a woman on the other side, staring intently at us. She looked to be in her early 30s, with dark hair and an intense gaze. "Can I help you?" Josh asked, confused. The woman didn't respond immediately. Instead, she just kept staring at us, her eyes moving from Josh to me, and then back to Josh. Finally, she spoke, her voice low and hoarse. "Sorry, I think I got lost. I'm looking for John's apartment. He rents out a room here in the building." I exchanged a quick glance with Josh, who seemed as confused as I was. "John?" he repeated. "No, you must have the wrong place. This is number 12. John's apartment must be on another floor." The woman hesitated for a moment and then slowly nodded. "Sorry, I must have gotten confused. Thank you anyway." She turned to leave, but then turned back, her gaze now piercing into our souls. "Be careful," she whispered, before disappearing into the darkness of the corridor. I shivered at her enigmatic warning. Who was that woman, and why did she seem so concerned about our safety? That was odd, Josh commented, closing the door and locking it again. Maybe she was looking for drugs or something. This place might not be as nice as we thought. My unease only grew as the night went on. Every strange noise, the creaking pipes, the wind howling through the window cracks, made me jump. Josh, absorbed in a book he had found on the shelf, seemed oblivious to my growing anxiety. "Have you noticed that there's not a soul on the street?" I asked, interrupting his silence. "It's almost like this place is depressing," Josh suggested, looking around. "Yeah, it's a bit gloomy," I agree. "But who knows, maybe it's like this because it's a Monday night." I sighed, unable to shake the feeling of discomfort. "I think it's more than that. It's almost like this apartment is a magnet for something sinister." Josh smiled, but his smile didn't reach his eyes. "Come on, don't start imagining things. This is just an Airbnb, not a horror movie set." However, my concerns only heightened when, for the third time that night, we saw shadows passing by the barred windows. People were looking in, their faces obscured by the darkness. "What the hell do they want?" I murmured, moving closer to the window. Josh joined me, his smile now completely gone. "I don't know, but it doesn't look good. Maybe we should call the host and ask if he knows anything." Before we could discuss it further, a loud sound made us turn. Someone was trying to force the door open. "What the hell?" Josh exclaimed, his eyes wide with surprise. We rushed to the door and Josh quickly unlocked the locks. Opening the door, we were confronted by a hooded figure who immediately fled into the darkness of the corridor. "Hey!" Josh shouted, chasing after the mysterious figure. My heart was pounding as I ran after Josh. "Wait, I don't think it's safe." Josh stopped in the corridor, his breath ragged, matching mine. "This is crazy. Who the hell are these people?" We returned to the apartment, locking all the locks, and spent the rest of the night on alert, barely sleeping. Every noise made us jump, wondering if someone was trying to break in again. "We should leave," I whispered to Josh, who was awake, staring at the door. "It's obviously not safe here." He nodded, his eyes reflecting the same fear I felt. "Yes, I think you're right. Let's get out of here at dawn. I don't want to spend another minute in this place." We barely waited for the sun to rise before we started packing our things, eager to escape the gloomy apartment. The host, who had not responded to our messages so far, seemed to have disappeared. When we finally left, relieved to be unharmed, we saw a group of people across the street, watching our apartment. They seemed to be lurking, their expressions somber. "What the hell is this?" Josh muttered, gripping my arm. "Do they have been waiting for us?" We ran away, our hearts pounding, and didn't look back. It wasn't until later, when we were safe in a cafe, that we finally relaxed enough to discuss what had just happened. "That was surreal," Josh said, still visibly shaken. "Who were those people? Why were they watching us?" I shook my head, still confused. "I have no idea. But something very strange is going on in that apartment. I feel like there's a mystery here, something we couldn't quite understand." Our experiences that night remained an enigma. Later, we found out that the apartment had been the scene of several strange incidents in the past, including mysterious break-ins and reports of people feeling watched. We never discovered the truth behind those disturbing events, but one thing was certain. Our stay in that haunted Airbnb was one of the scariest experiences of our lives. My name is Chloe, and I have always been an adventurer at heart. But on that chilly autumn night in Chicago, I would wish I had never booked that Airbnb. The promise of a cozy nook in the host's words would turn into something quite different. Upon arriving at the address, my fiancé, Adam, and I were intrigued and a bit suspicious of the place. The apartment was in the basement of an old building. The windows were large, letting in daylight, but there was something dark about the atmosphere, an almost palpable feeling that we were not alone. The photos didn't quite capture the place, I remarked as we stepped inside. The apartment was spacious, with high ceilings and creaky wooden floors, but there was something unsettling about the decor. The walls, painted in a dark shade, seemed to absorb the light, and the heavy curtains blocked the view outside, creating a claustrophobic feel. As we walked through the apartment, I felt a constant chill at the back of my neck. "Maybe the host values privacy," Adam suggested, noticing my worried glance. I agreed, although a persistent sense of discomfort remained. As we explored the apartment, I noticed something peculiar. "Wait," I said, stopping in the living room. "The photos only showed 2 doors here, but there's a third one." Adam furrowed his brow, examining the room. "You're right. That extra door is intriguing." My curiosity was piqued, but we decided to leave the exploration for later. As night fell, the apartment seemed even gloomier and more mysterious. Shadows danced on the walls, and the wind howled outside, making the windows rattle. I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. As we prepared for bed, I heard a soft noise coming from the kitchen. I peered out of the bedroom and saw Adam rummaging through the fridge. "I can't sleep," he murmured, noticing my presence. "Let's explore a bit. I'm curious about that extra door." My heart raced, a mix of excitement and apprehension. Together we ventured into the living room, lighting our way with the glow from our cell phones. I opened the first door, revealing an ordinary bedroom. The next was a bathroom, with vintage tiles and a clawfoot tub. All normal so far, but then I spotted a third door, partially hidden by the heavy curtain. My heart pounded as I pulled the handle. The door creaked open, revealing a spiral staircase leading downward. "This wasn't in the photos," I whispered, descending the steps cautiously. The air was colder here, and a musty smell filled my nostrils. Adam turned on the light, revealing a huge basement, unlike any I'd ever seen. The stone walls were uneven, and the dirt floor seemed untouched for years. There was a strong, pungent odor of dampness and something else. Something metallic. "What a strange place," Adam commented, his voice echoing in the empty space. My eyes widened as I spotted chains on the floor, attached to iron rings. Several wooden doors with old locks were lined up along one wall. The place looked like something out of a horror movie. "This is disturbing," I said, my voice sounding loud in the hollow space. "Why would anyone have chains and so many locked doors down here?" Adam ran his hand through the chains, his face illuminated by the cell phone light. "Maybe the host has some weird hobby or a secret business." A shiver ran down my spine as I heard a muffled sound, as if something was moving behind one of the doors. "Did you hear that?" I asked, my heart pounding. Adam frowned, his expression turning worried. "What the hell is that?" The sound repeated, a faint scratching coming from one of the doors. My entire body was on alert, and a sense of impending danger washed over me. "There's something down here," I said, my voice trembling. "Something, or someone." Adam moved in front of me, his protective instinct kicking in. "Let's get out of here. This isn't right." And we turned to climb the stairs. But at that moment we heard a loud noise, as if something heavy had been knocked over. The door behind us trembled on its hinges. My heart was in my throat as I raced up the stairs. Adam was right behind me, his face set in determination. We reached the apartment breathless, the sound of our footsteps echoing in the confined space. Once inside, we paused to catch our breath, our eyes meeting. "What the hell is going on here?" I asked, my voice reflecting my fear. Adam shook his head, his eyes scanning the room for answers. "I don't know, but we need to get out of here now." We hastily gathered our belongings and left the apartment, the sound of our footsteps echoing in the corridor. The cold night air hit us as we stepped outside, and we leaned against each other, trying to catch our breath. "What was that?" I asked, my body still trembling. Adam shook his head, his eyes mirroring the same fear I felt. "I don't know, but we're not sticking around to find out." We ran down the street, seeking a safe place to hide. The feeling of being watched was overwhelming, and I couldn't get the image of the chains and locked doors out of my head. Finally, we stumbled upon a cafe that was still open and sat in a corner, trying to process what we had just experienced. "Do you think someone was trapped down there?" I asked, my heart still racing. Adam sighed. "I don't know, but we're not calling the police. We don't want to get involved. Let's just leave Chicago and forget this ever happened." My instinct told me to agree, but a part of me wanted answers. Who was the host? Why was there a secret basement? And what, or who, was locked behind those doors? Unfortunately, we would never find the answers. We caught the first train home the next day, trying to leave the scary experience behind. But at night, when I close my eyes, I still see the secret basement and hear the chilling sounds. That Airbnb would haunt my dreams for a long time. If you enjoyed the video you just watched, you won't want to miss this next one. Click now and I'll see you there.